She stood in $500,000 worth of white lace in silence, while the man she was supposed to marry walked out of the ballroom without once turning around. 300 witnesses, 12 mafia captains, 2 crime families watching from opposite sides of an aisle, and Celeste Rowan standing at the altar with her hands perfectly still and her veil catching the light like something out of a dream, while Damien Viscari chose another woman in front of all of them. The city would talk about this for years. What the city never figured out was that Celeste had been counting on it. If this story already has you hooked, stay until the very end, because what comes next will destroy everything you think you know about power, betrayal, and who really holds the knife. Hit that like button now, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning of the wedding, Chicago smelled like rain that hadn't decided to fall yet. That low, pressing weight in the air that made everything feel temporary, like the city itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which way things broke. Celeste Rowan had been awake since 4. She sat in the vanity chair of the bridal suite at the Caldwell Grand, a hotel her family had owned outright for 11 years, which meant every employee on the floor answered to her father first and the front desk second. And she watched the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows while the makeup artist worked around her stillness. 17 stories down, the first delivery trucks were already moving through the pre-dawn streets. Flower vendors, linen services. The ordinary world doing ordinary things, while up here, in this room, the 2 most powerful criminal organizations in the state were preparing to shake hands through her body. She let the makeup artist work. She let the hairstylist pin and curl and spray. She answered when her mother spoke to her, smiled when her younger sister adjusted the veil, laughed softly when the photographer asked her to tilt her chin up. She was flawless at this, had been flawless at it for 26 years, being the thing other people needed her to be. The dress had cost $40,000. It fit her like it had been made from her own skin, which it almost had. 3 fittings, 2 alterations, a seamstress who had flown in from Milan because Damien wanted the best of everything his money could announce. And it could announce plenty. Damien Viscari at 41 was the most powerful crime boss Chicago had seen in 30 years. And the city knew it the way it knew the temperature of the river, constantly, without having to check. Celeste's father, Gerald Rowan, ran the financial architecture that kept Damien's empire clean. Shell companies, investment vehicles. Real estate holdings layered 3 and 4 entities deep, so the FBI would need a decade and a court order just to find the floor. Gerald was brilliant, methodical, and utterly devoted to the idea that his daughter marrying Damien Viscari was the single greatest achievement of their family's complicated history. He'd said so, at least twice, during the rehearsal dinner. Celeste had smiled and raised her champagne glass. At 9:15 in the morning, her phone buzzed on the vanity. She glanced at it. A text from a number she didn't recognize, but the message was only 4 words, and it made the makeup artist pause because Celeste went very still. She set the phone face down without responding. "You all right?" the makeup artist asked. "Fine," Celeste said. "Little cold in here. Can someone check the thermostat?" By 10, the hotel was organized chaos. The ballroom on the 4th floor had been transformed 3 days earlier. White roses, black tablecloths, 260 chairs arranged in perfect rows with blood-red sashes on every aisle seat. Damien had chosen black and white. Celeste had suggested the red accents. He'd approved without asking why, and she hadn't told him that red was the color of something ending, not beginning. The ceremony was scheduled for noon. By 11:40, Celeste was dressed, photographed, and sitting alone in the bridal suite anteroom while her bridal party went down to take their positions. Her mother had been crying, the good kind, she insisted, the proud kind, and her sister had hugged her twice and said she looked like something out of a painting. The photographer had used the word ethereal. Celeste had thanked everyone and asked for 5 minutes alone. She got them. She sat in the quiet room and looked at the engagement ring on her left hand. 3-carat princess cut, platinum setting, flanked by 2 smaller stones that alone would have been impressive. She'd worn it for 14 months. She knew its weight exactly, had felt it the way you feel anything you wear long enough, less like jewelry and more like a fact about yourself. Her phone buzzed again. This time, she answered. "Tell me it's confirmed," she said quietly. The voice on the other end was male, careful, unhurried. 40 minutes ago, She landed at Midway on a private charter. She called him from the car. Celeste was quiet for 3 seconds. And he answered. He answered. She let out a slow breath. All right. You're still going down there? Of course I'm still going down there. She stood, shook out her dress, checked her reflection once in the full-length mirror by the door. That's the whole point. She ended the call, dropped the phone into the small bag her sister was holding downstairs, and walked to the elevator. The ballroom at the Caldwell Grand held 300 people when fully configured, and today it was fully configured. Celeste could hear the quartet from the hallway, something classical, something appropriate, the kind of music chosen to signal occasion and gravity. She paused outside the double doors, accepted her bouquet from the florist's assistant who'd been stationed there for exactly this moment, and took a slow breath. Her father appeared at her elbow, face tight with pride and something closer to relief. He'd been nervous all morning, though he'd tried to hide it. Gerald Rowan was a man who understood leverage and risk at a molecular level, had spent 30 years managing both. But he'd never been comfortable with the human variables. That was always Celeste's territory. Ready? He asked. Always, she said. He took her arm. The doors opened. 300 people stood. The ballroom was extraordinary. The roses were everywhere, white and tiered and cascading from arrangements taller than a man. And the candlelight from 100 white pillars caught the crystal chandelier overhead and spread light across the room like something deliberate. The music shifted. The guests turned. And there, at the far end of the aisle, standing at the altar in a black suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, was Damien Vescari. He was looking at her. Celeste walked. She kept her eyes on him and her pace steady and her breathing even, 30 feet, 20. She could see the altar ahead, could see the officiant in his dark suit, could see the best man and the groomsmen arranged on the right. She could see Damien's face clearly now, the sharp jaw, the gray at his temples, the dark eyes that had always watched her like she was a calculation he hadn't finished yet. She was 10 feet from the altar when his phone vibrated. She saw it in his face before she saw him move. A flicker, a contraction, something behind his eyes shutting down and rerouting. He reached into his jacket pocket. He looked at the screen. The room didn't notice yet. The music was still playing. Her father was still holding her arm. Damien looked up from the phone. He looked at her. And for 1 second, one single, specific second, she saw something cross his face that she couldn't fully name. Not guilt, not regret. Something rawer and less examined than either of those things. Then he looked at the best man, Marco, 40 years old, Vescari lieutenant since he was 19, and he said something that Celeste could not hear from where she was standing. Marco's face changed immediately. Damien stepped back from the altar. Her father stopped walking. The music kept going for another 4 bars before the quartet understood something was wrong and trailed off one instrument at a time. The silence came in pieces, and then it was total. Damien Vescari walked toward the side exit of the ballroom without looking at anyone, without explanation, without hesitation, without a single word to the woman standing 6 feet away in $40,000 of white silk. The room held its breath. Celeste stood at the end of the aisle and watched him go. Marco caught up to Damien at the door, and they exchanged 6 words. She counted. And then Damien was through the door, and it was swinging shut behind him, and 300 people were sitting in a ballroom that had just become a very different kind of occasion. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then the murmuring started, that low, collective shifting of air that 300 people make when they're all trying to process the same impossible thing at the same time. She heard her mother make a sound. She heard someone near the front say Damien's name like a question. She heard her father beside her, his breath coming fast and sharp, his hand tightening on her arm. Celeste, don't, she said quietly. She was still holding the bouquet. She stood exactly where she was and let the room look at her, because that was what the room needed. To look at the woman who had just been left at the altar in front of every person who mattered in 2 criminal organizations. She let them take it in. She let it settle. She kept her face perfectly composed, which was the thing that would be talked about later, the thing people would remember and reinterpret and argue about for years, that she hadn't cried, that she hadn't moved, that she had simply stood there in the middle of it all like a woman who had already decided what happened next. She was there for 90 seconds. Long enough. Then she handed the bouquet to her father, removed the engagement ring from her finger, set it in his palm with the same deliberateness you'd set down a key you no longer needed, and walked back the way she'd come. Not running. Walking. The doors closed behind her. In the elevator, alone, she closed her eyes and pressed the button for the 17th floor. The doors slid shut. The car began to rise. And in the privacy of that small vertical box, with no one watching and nothing to perform, a very small smile moved across Celeste Rowan's face, and then was gone before the doors opened again. Vivian Cross had been dead for 14 months. That was the official version, anyway. The version that had circulated through Chicago's underworld in the careful, undramatic way that certain kinds of information circulate when powerful people want it believed without drawing attention to the believing. 14 months ago, a woman named Vivian Cross, formerly the intended wife of Damien Vescari, had apparently died in a boating accident off the coast of Miami. No body recovered. Damien had been informed, had arranged a private memorial that almost no one was invited to, and had moved on with the particular ruthlessness of a man who'd learned early that grief was a vulnerability he couldn't afford. 6 months after that, he'd proposed to Celeste Rowan. Gerald Rowan had practically trembled when he told his daughter. A merger, he'd called it. A consolidation of two families whose interests had always been adjacent but never joined. Damien needed clean money management. Gerald's operation was the best in the city. Celeste needed... Gerald hadn't finished that sentence out loud, but she'd understood what he meant. She needed to be useful in a way that kept the family protected. She'd said yes to the proposal with her hands folded in her lap, and a look on her face that Damien had probably read as composure. What it actually was arithmetic. Celeste had met Vivian Cross once, 2 years earlier, at a fundraiser that served as cover for a meeting between 3 of the city's major criminal entities. Vivian had been with Damien then, stunning, controlled, with the kind of smile that never fully reached her eyes because her eyes were always doing something else. They'd spoken for 8 minutes in a corner of a ballroom that looked nothing like the one downstairs. Celeste had come away from that conversation with 2 specific impressions. Vivian Cross was smarter than anyone in that room gave her credit for, and she was absolutely not the kind of woman who disappeared quietly. When the boating accident story came out, Celeste had filed it under things that required further attention and gone back to work. She was a financial architect by training and by instinct, had an MBA from Wharton, had worked 3 years in legitimate investment banking before her father's business had needed her full attention. She understood money the way some people understood music, intuitively and in structures, able to hear the underlying pattern beneath the surface noise. She had spent the last 14 months managing the Vescari financial network from the inside, because that was her role, because Gerald had positioned her there, and because it gave her access to everything she would eventually need. She had been building something, quietly, patiently, in the spaces Damien never thought to watch, because they were occupied by a woman he'd already categorized. His name was Roman De Luca, and Celeste had known him for 7 years. They'd met in a conference room, a real one, a legitimate one, a mergers and acquisitions meeting in a glass tower in the Loop where 3 entities were negotiating a real estate holding. Roman was 29 then, the youngest son of Franco De Luca, whose operation covered the South Side with the kind of territorial consistency that other crime families envied. Roman had been brought to the meeting as his father's numbers man, which was a significant underestimation of what Roman actually was. Celeste had figured that out in the first 40 minutes. They'd had lunch afterward, separately from everyone else. They'd talked about bond structures and offshore vehicle regulation, and a paper one of them had read about financial forensics in criminal enterprises. It had been, without question, one of the most interesting conversations Celeste had had in a professional context, and she was not a woman who said that easily. They'd stayed in contact. Carefully, sporadically, always at arm's length because their respective families were not enemies exactly, but they occupied adjacent territories that required a certain careful distance. Roman had eventually moved up through his father's organization the way water moves uphill, through every alternative route available, finding pressure points, filling spaces, until the day came, 3 years ago now, when Franco De Luca had died of a heart attack at 68, and Roman had stepped into the role of head of the De Luca syndicate with a calm that had surprised everyone except Celeste. She'd sent him a single text the day after Franco's funeral. It had said, "I heard. I'm sorry about your father. When you're ready to talk, I'm here." He'd responded 3 weeks later. They'd met in a coffee shop in Pilsen that neither of their respective organizations would have thought to surveil. They'd talked for 4 hours. That had been the beginning of the architecture Celeste was still, very quietly, constructing. Roman De Luca was 36 now. He was calculating and patient, and he understood power the way engineers understand load-bearing weight, not as something to display, but as something to distribute correctly or watch collapse. He did not trust easily, and the fact that he trusted Celeste was something he'd arrived at through years of specific, provable evidence rather than instinct or feeling. He was also, Celeste had understood for some time, the person she would need when the moment she'd been building toward finally arrived. She'd called him the night she accepted Damien's proposal. "You're doing it," he'd said, not a question. "I'm doing it." A pause on his end. She could hear him breathing, could picture him wherever he was. Roman always seemed to be somewhere slightly windswept, near a window or outside. "You know he'll absorb everything your father built. The moment that ring goes on your finger, the Rowan operation is a Vescari asset." "I know. And you're comfortable with that." "I'm comfortable with the access it creates," she said, "for a period of time. Not indefinitely." He'd been quiet for a moment, then, "How long?" 14 months, she'd said, "give or take." She heard him think about that. 14 months to do what, exactly? "To learn where everything is buried," she said, "before I help dig it up." She was back in the bridal suite by 12:15. Her phone had been ringing continuously since the moment she'd returned to the floor. Her mother, her sister, 2 of her bridesmaids, and at least 6 numbers she didn't recognize, which meant word had already started moving. Word always moved fast in Chicago, but in their world it moved at the speed of fear. And right now everyone who'd been sitting in that ballroom was on the phone, trying to figure out what just happened and what it meant for them personally. Celeste ignored all of it. She went to the closet where her overnight bag was hanging, changed out of the wedding dress with the careful efficiency of someone diffusing equipment. No drama, no tears, just the methodical unfastening and removal of a thing that had served its purpose. She folded it neatly over the chair. She dressed in clothes she'd packed without telling anyone. Dark trousers, a gray silk blouse, flat shoes. She pulled her hair back. She removed the rest of the jewelry. She looked like herself again. She looked like someone who had just come from a meeting. Then she sat at the desk by the window and opened her laptop. She had 3 accounts to access, 2 fund transfers to initiate, and a phone call with Roman scheduled for 1 o'clock. She had exactly 43 minutes. She got to work. What Damien Vescari had never fully understood about Celeste Rowan had never been curious enough to investigate, because men in his position rarely found it necessary to look hard at the women their families had arranged for them, was that her role in his financial operation was not supportive. It was foundational. Gerald moved the architecture Gerald had built. Celeste maintained it, audited it, and more importantly understood it at a depth that Gerald, for all his brilliance, had never quite reached. She had spent 14 months inside the Vescari financial network not learning how it worked, but learning every point at which it was dependent on her continued cooperation. The shell companies that held the real estate required quarterly filings managed through a series of accounts she administered directly. The investment vehicles that cleaned the cash flow from 3 of Damien's largest operations required authorization codes that rotated on a schedule she designed. 3 of Damien's most trusted financial lieutenants had been hired on her recommendation and answered to her operationally in ways that were never discussed openly but were entirely real. She had built herself into the structure with the patience of someone who intended to be very difficult to remove. Damien had never noticed because Damien had always seen her as a component. Smart, useful, well-positioned, but a component, not the architect. That was his most expensive mistake. She transferred the first fund at 12:22. It was not a theft, not precisely, not legally, not in any way that could be easily prosecuted. It was a redirection of assets she had legitimate administrative authority over, moved into a vehicle that she and Roman had constructed over the past 8 months specifically for this purpose. The second transfer followed at 12:31. Both moves were quiet, precise, and buried inside normal operational traffic in a way that would take Damien's accountants weeks to find, if they knew where to look. Which they wouldn't, because they'd built their search protocols around the threats Damien had already imagined, and Celeste wasn't one of them. She was on the phone with Roman at 1:02, 3 minutes late. "I heard," he said when she answered. "Are you all right?" "I'm better than all right," she said. "He did exactly what I needed him to do, in front of 300 people." A beat. The Vivian angle played out. Completely. We knew it would. "Knowing and seeing are different things," she said. "It needed to happen visibly. It needed to be the thing everyone talks about. Because in 6 months, when people are looking for an explanation for what's happening to his operation, the story they'll tell themselves is that he humiliated the woman who was running his books, and she walked. Simple cause and effect. It won't occur to them to look deeper." "And the transfers?" "Done. Clean. I need 48 hours before I move the next layer." "Take 72, Roman said. "Don't rush this part. We have room." She looked out the window at the Chicago skyline, the gray sky pressing down, the lake a dark line in the east, the city going about its business 17 floors below. Somewhere in this city, Damien Viscari was with Vivian Cross right now, probably at the townhouse on North Clark, his private residence, the one he kept off the main Viscari property roster. She knew about it because she knew about everything. That was the thing about being the person who managed the money. Eventually, the money told you where everything was. "There's something you should know," Roman said. His voice had shifted, dropped a register, become careful. "About Vivian." "Tell me." "She didn't come back because she was in danger, or not only because of that." He paused. "She came back because someone told her what was happening, with you, with the transfer timeline." Celeste went still. "Someone told her. I don't have the source yet, but the timing is too precise to be coincidence. She landed 40 minutes before your ceremony. She called him from the car. That's not fear, that's theater. Someone scripted that entrance." Celeste breathed slowly, steadily, "Which means she has a contact inside. Inside your operation or mine. I'm working on narrowing it." "How long?" "Days? Maybe a week?" "All right." She closed the laptop. "It doesn't change the timeline. If anything, it accelerates it, because if she knows we're moving, she'll push Damien to look at his finances sooner rather than later." "It's a risk." "Everything is a risk," Celeste said. "The question is whether the position is worth the exposure, and it is. We're too far in to pull back now." Silence on the line. Then Roman said, "I want to move the security detail to you tonight. 2 of my people. Non-negotiable." She started to refuse, then stopped herself. Roman didn't say non-negotiable lightly. "Fine. Have them check in through the service entrance on Wabash." "Already done," he said. "They went there an hour ago." She laughed, once, short and dry. "You had them there before I agreed." "I had them there before the ceremony started," Roman said. "I knew he was going to walk." She was quiet for a moment. "How?" "Because I know what kind of man he is," Roman said. "And I know what kind of woman you are. And those 2 things were never going to survive in the same room." She didn't respond to that. There wasn't a response to it that wouldn't cost her something, and she was in the business of not spending what she didn't need to. "I'll check in tonight," she said instead. "Keep working on the source." "Celeste." His voice again changed again, quieter, more direct. "He's going to come after you. Not today, not tomorrow. But when he starts losing pieces and doesn't understand why, he's going to look for someone to blame. And the woman he left at the altar is a very comfortable answer." "I know," she said. "You're not worried." "I'm worried about everything, Roman. I'm just not letting it make decisions for me." She ended the call. She sat for a moment in the quiet hotel room, in the middle of what was supposed to be her wedding day, with her folded dress on the chair and her laptop closed, and the city outside the glass doing what it always did, moving, crowding, grinding forward, indifferent to who'd just gotten married or hadn't. Then she stood, picked up her bag, and walked out of the Caldwell Grand through the service exit on the south side of the building. Her car was already waiting. Not the town car that had been arranged for the wedding, but her own car, driven by a man who answered only to her. She didn't look back at the building. Wait. Damien Vescari found Vivian Cross in the back of a black SUV on a side street 2 blocks from the Caldwell Grand, which was where she'd told him to come, and which he'd agreed to without fully examining why he was agreeing to it. He'd left 300 people in a ballroom. He'd left his ceremony, his arrangement, the political architecture his family had spent a year constructing. He'd done all of that because Vivian Cross had called him from a car and told him her life was in danger and she had information he needed to hear immediately. He told himself it was operational, that whatever Vivian knew was worth the cost of what he was walking away from. He told himself that Celeste would understand, eventually, that these things happened, that there were realities in their world that overrode personal arrangements. He told himself a lot of things in the 90 seconds it took to get from the altar to the side door. He didn't tell himself he'd missed Vivian. He wasn't prepared to look at that directly yet. She was thinner than he remembered. That was the first thing he registered when he got in the car. That she'd lost weight she hadn't had to lose, and her face was sharper for it, more angular, more intense. Her dark hair was shorter. She was wearing something simple, dark, wrong for the season. She looked like a woman who'd been living carefully, constantly, without much margin for softness. "You actually came," she said. "You said your life was in danger." "It is." She met his eyes. "Someone has been trying to track me for months. I thought I was secure. I wasn't. 3 weeks ago, I found a trace. Someone close to you, Damien. Someone inside your operation." He studied her. He was a man who'd spent 20 years in a world where information was always partly a weapon, and he was looking at her the way he looked at everything in that world, weighing, measuring, not deciding until he had more. "Why come back now? Why not call? Send a message?" "Because I needed you to see me," she said. "I needed you to understand this isn't—" She stopped, pressed her hands together in her lap. "I needed you to know it's real. Whatever you think about why I'm here, this is real." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside the car, the city moved normally. No one knew he was sitting here. No one knew he'd just done what he'd done. "Who's the contact?" he said. "I don't have a name yet. I have a method. The way information was moving, it tracks to someone with access to your financial network." Something shifted in his chest. He didn't show it. Financial network. The shell structure, the investment vehicles. Whoever it is has access deep enough to track fund movements. She watched his face. "Does that narrow it for you?" Damien sat with that. Thought about who had that access. Thought about Gerald Rowan. Thought about Celeste, who had been running his books for 14 months, who was currently standing in a ballroom 300 feet away, being looked at by everyone who mattered in his world. Thought about the timing of all of this. "I need to make some calls," he said. "Of course." Vivian looked away, out the window. "I'm sorry for the timing. I understand what you just—" "Don't." His voice was flat. "Not right now." She nodded and was quiet. He pulled out his phone. He had 12 missed calls, which he ignored. He scrolled instead to the number for his chief financial auditor, a man named Patterson, who was thorough and humorless and whom Damien paid specifically to be available at all hours. Patterson answered on the second ring. "I need a full audit of the Tier 1 vehicles," Damien said. "Today, not tomorrow. I need eyes on every authorized transaction in the past 72 hours. A pause. "Today is Saturday. And you're supposed to be—" "I know what day it is," Damien said. "Today. I'll authorize the overtime. Get it done." He ended the call. He looked out the opposite window from Vivian and thought about Celeste Rowan standing at the end of that aisle, with her hands perfectly still and her face composed and her eyes watching him walk away. He thought about how she hadn't moved, hadn't called after him, hadn't made a sound. He told himself that was dignity. Now, for the first time, a different possibility entered the room. He pulled up her contact in his phone. His thumb hovered over her name for 3 seconds. He didn't call. The audit results came back in 6 hours. Patterson called at 7:15 that evening. his voice carrying the particular careful flatness of a man delivering information he doesn't fully understand the implications of. "There are 2 transfers," Patterson said, "both within operational parameters, both with proper authorization codes. But the destination vehicles, I've checked twice, they don't connect to any of our registered holding structures. The money went somewhere clean, Mr. Viscari, somewhere I've never seen before." Damien was standing in the kitchen of the North Clark townhouse. Vivian was in the other room. He pressed the phone harder against his ear. "How much?" Patterson told him. It wasn't catastrophic. It was, relative to the total architecture of what Damien managed, a fraction. But it was the kind of fraction that a surgeon would notice. A precise amount moved at a precise time through a precise mechanism, not a theft born of panic or opportunity. A controlled excision. "Find the destination," Damien said. "I'm working on it. But whoever designed the vehicle, they knew what they were doing. This is going to take time." "Make less time." He ended the call. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at nothing. Then he went to the cabinet above the refrigerator and took down the bottle of scotch he kept there and poured 2 inches into a glass and didn't drink it. Just looked at it. Thought about what Patterson had said. Proper authorization codes. Vehicles I've never seen before. There were exactly 4 people in his organization with the access and the ability to construct something like that. Patterson was one of them. 2 of the others were men he'd worked with for 15 years, men whose children he knew by name, men who'd taken bullets for the Viscari name in ways that left visible evidence. The 4th was a woman he'd left at an altar 7 hours ago. He picked up the glass and drank. In the other room, Vivian was on her phone, speaking quietly. He couldn't hear the words. He didn't go to the doorway to listen, told himself it was because he trusted her, though that wasn't entirely it. It was more that he wasn't ready for what he might hear if he tried. He poured another 2 inches. He thought about Celeste, about the 14 months she'd spent inside his operation, about the access he'd given her because she was Gerald's daughter, and Gerald's operation was what made everything else function. About the way she'd always been quiet in meetings, always been 10 steps ahead of whatever was being discussed, always steered conversations toward outcomes that made sense without ever being obvious about the steering. He'd appreciated that about her, had thought it was loyalty. He was starting to understand it might have been strategy. The scotch burned going down. He set the glass in the sink and braced both hands on the counter and looked at the kitchen wall and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Something he'd spent 20 years building structures specifically to avoid feeling. He felt outmaneuvered. He'd left her at the altar, he'd walked out of that ballroom, and he had not looked back, because looking back was not what men like him did. And he'd understood in that moment only that Vivian was calling, and Vivian was his history, and history had a pull that arrangement couldn't fully counter. He'd made a calculation. He'd made it fast, the way he made everything, and he'd executed it without hesitation. And somewhere in this city, the woman he'd left standing alone in white silk was sitting at a desk with a laptop and a phone and a plan that she'd been building before he ever put a ring on her finger. His phone buzzed. A text from Marco. Celeste checked out of the Caldwell at 1:45 p.m. Car went south on Michigan. We lost it at Van Buren. Damien read the text twice. Then he put the phone face down on the counter. She'd been gone for 6 hours. She'd changed out of the dress, packed a bag, and disappeared into the city in under 2 hours, while he was sitting in an SUV with Vivian listening to theories about moles in his financial network. He'd been so busy looking at what Vivian was pointing at, he hadn't looked at where Vivian's finger was actually pointing. He grabbed the phone again, called Marco. "Find her," he said when Marco answered. "Not tomorrow, tonight." "We're already trying," Marco said. "She's not at her apartment, not at the family house. Her phone is going straight to voicemail." "What about Gerald?" A pause. "Gerald Rowan called 3 times this afternoon. You didn't answer." "I'm calling him now." He hung up. He stood in the kitchen of a townhouse he'd bought for privacy, with Vivian Cross on the other side of the wall, and he scrolled to Gerald Rowan and called. The phone rang 4 times. Gerald Rowan, the man whose entire professional existence was tied to Damien's operation, whose family's safety depended on Damien's goodwill, who had planned and arranged and maneuvered for a year to bring this marriage into being. Gerald Rowan did not answer. Damien lowered the phone slowly. The city hummed outside the townhouse windows. Somewhere south of where he was standing, in a direction he couldn't quite locate, Celeste Rowan was doing something he hadn't anticipated and hadn't protected against. That much was no longer a question. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know yet, was how long she'd been doing it, or how deep it went, or how many of the people he trusted most were already standing on the other side of the line she'd drawn. He would find out, that was certain. He was Damien Vescari, and he had never in 20 years lost control of a situation he'd decided to get back. But for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't entirely sure he could. He stood in the kitchen until the Scotch warmth faded, until the city settled into full dark outside, until Vivian came to the doorway and asked if he was all right, and he turned to look at her with a face she couldn't read, which was a thing she'd always found unsettling about him, and said, "Tell me everything, from the beginning. Leave nothing out." Because he needed to understand what Vivian actually knew, and why she'd come back at exactly this moment, and who exactly had told her to. He was starting to have a thought about that, a thought he didn't fully want to follow to its end. But Damien Vescari had not built an empire by refusing to look at uncomfortable conclusions. He pulled out a chair at the kitchen table. "Sit down," he said. "We're going to be here a while." Vivian sat. She folded her hands in front of her and looked at him with those eyes that never quite showed everything. She opened her mouth to begin. And 3 floors below the North Clark townhouse, in a sedan parked in the alley behind the building, a man with a burner phone sent a single text to a number only 2 people in the city had. "He's asking. It starts now." The response came in 4 seconds. "Good. Let him ask." The man in the alley waited 20 minutes after sending the text before he drove away. Slow, no lights, until he hit the cross street, the kind of careful that looks like nothing from a second-floor window. His name was Eddie Tran, and he had worked for Damien Vescari for 6 years as a mid-level courier, the kind of role that made you invisible because everyone assumed you were only moving paper. He was, in fact, moving considerably more than paper, had been for the past 4 months. Celeste had found him through a contact in Damien's accounting department, had sat across from him in a diner on the west side with a cup of coffee she didn't drink, and a number she wrote on a napkin, and had said exactly 9 words to him. "You already know what this is. Take your time." He'd called back in 3 days. By the time Eddie's car turned north on Dearborn, Celeste was 40 minutes away in a converted loft space above a dry goods importer in Bridgeport that Roman DeLuca had held under a subsidiary name for 2 years. It wasn't glamorous. Exposed brick, industrial heating that groaned when it cycled on, 2 folding tables pushed together to create a work surface, 3 laptops, and a whiteboard covered in a network map that would have taken Damien's best analyst a week to fully read. Roman was already there when she arrived, standing at the whiteboard with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, looking at the map like it owed him something. He heard her come in but didn't turn immediately. That was Roman. He always finished the thought first. "Eddie checked in," he said. "I know, I got the same text." She set her bag down, pulled a chair to the table, opened the laptop closest to her. "Damien's running an audit." "Patterson?" "Patterson." She pulled up a screen, scanned it. "He'll find the transfers inside 48 hours. I built them to be findable. Eventually. Not immediately." Roman turned from the whiteboard then. He had a particular way of looking at her when she said things like that, a kind of arrested attention, like a man watching a card trick and knowing the trick is happening and still not being able to catch the moment. "You built them to be findable." "I built them to look like the work of someone who was good but not perfect. Someone who was angry and moving fast." She met his eyes. "Because that's the story Damien needs to believe. That I panicked and grabbed what I could and ran. If the transfers look too clean, he'll know it's a longer play. If they look like controlled rage, he'll spend his energy chasing the wrong theory." Roman was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled the other chair out and sat. "You've been thinking about his psychology for a long time." "I've been living inside it for 14 months. "And Vivian?" Celeste's hands paused on the keyboard, just for a half second, less than anyone but Roman would have caught. "Vivian is the variable I can't fully predict. That's why she's useful to him and dangerous to us. She's not following a script, she's improvising. She had help getting back into the city. I know, Celeste said it evenly without looking up. Someone inside either our structure or yours gave her timing information, which means we have a problem that isn't Damien. Roman leaned forward, arms on the table. I've narrowed it to 3 people on my side. I'll have a name by Thursday. I need it by Wednesday. Then I'll have it by Wednesday. She nodded. Outside the loft's single high window, the city had gone fully dark. It was past 9. The dry goods importer below was locked and quiet. The street outside was residential enough that there was no foot traffic, no ambient noise except the occasional car, and the heating system working against the October cold. The next phase, Roman said. Talk me through the timeline. Celeste turned the laptop so he could see the screen. On it was a network diagram, a simpler version of the whiteboard map, rendered in clean lines with nodes labeled in alphanumeric codes rather than names. She touched 3 of the nodes in sequence. These 3 distribution channels generate 38% of Damien's liquid cash flow. They run through front businesses, 2 restaurants, a freight logistics company on the north side. The logistics company's operating license comes up for renewal in 6 weeks. I already have the contact at the city inspector's office. 1 call, and that renewal gets complicated. Complicated how? Delayed. Extended review. Noise about fire code compliance in the warehouse. Nothing that rises to the level of criminal exposure, nothing that points back to us, just bureaucratic friction that slows the cash flow and costs him time and money and management attention. Roman studied the screen. And the restaurants? The executive chef at the larger one is undocumented. That was Vescari's arrangement. He covers the chef's status in exchange for the restaurant serving as a regular meeting point for certain conversations he doesn't want recorded elsewhere. I have a contact at ICE who owes me a favor that I've been holding for 2 years. She looked at Roman steadily. I don't want to use the immigration angle lightly. The chef is collateral damage I'd prefer to avoid. Then don't use it yet. Keep it in reserve. Agreed. The logistics company is enough for phase 1. She reached past him and touched the whiteboard marker lying on the table. The bigger move is his lieutenant network. Roman was quiet. Damien runs 12 captains across the city, Celeste said. 3 of them are independent enough in their thinking that they've been watching the Vescari operation with something other than total loyalty. They've never acted on it because the math didn't add up. Damien was too strong, too consolidated. Leaving cost more than staying. She paused. That math is about to change. You've been talking to them. It wasn't quite a question. Roman said it with the particular neutrality of a man who's processed something faster than he expected to. Not directly, Celeste said. Through intermediaries, over a long period of time. Nothing that could be traced to a specific conversation, just the gradual transmission of information that helps them see their situation more clearly. Roman looked at her. She met it. He said, How many of the 12? 3 are already moving. 2 more are in the process of doing arithmetic. She folded her hands on the table. By the time Damien understands what's happening to his captain structure, it won't be 5 people reconsidering. It'll be a trend he can't reverse. Roman was quiet for another moment. Then he said slowly, You've been building this since before he proposed. I've been building it since the day Vivian Cross allegedly died in a boating accident, and I didn't believe it. The heating system groaned. Roman looked at the whiteboard. He looked at the laptop screen. He looked at the woman across the table from him, who'd spent the morning standing at an altar in a $40,000 dress, executing the opening move of a plan she'd constructed over the better part of a year, and he said, I want to be useful to this, not just adjacent to it. Tell me what you need from the DeLuca side that you haven't asked for yet. Celeste looked at him for a long moment. She had been careful, methodically careful, about how much she asked of Roman, because what she asked of him was a calculation with a specific weight. And she didn't spend weight she didn't need to. But they were past the point of careful. The transfers were done. Damien was running audits. Vivian was in the city. The next phase required resources she didn't have independently. I need muscle I'm not affiliated with, she said. 2 or 3 people who can move quietly and who Damien's network won't recognize. No DeLuca faces he knows. For what purpose? Protection first. But also, I have 3 meetings in the next week with people currently inside Damien's captain structure. Those meetings cannot be surveilled. I need security on the locations that doesn't connect to anything Damien could trace. Roman nodded. I have people. Out-of-state contractors I've used twice. Clean record with me. He paused. Anything else? The freight company that operates out of the port on the southeast side. The one that services the DeLuca import operation. I need to route something through it in the next 10 days. A financial instrument. The paper trail needs to look like a standard commercial transaction. What's actually moving? Capital, she said. Mine. Moving from a position that's currently exposed into a structure that Damien can't touch. She looked at him directly. I'm not asking you to take on my risk. The instrument is clean. I just need the routing. Roman studied her face. You're positioning your own assets. I'm protecting them, she said. There's a difference. Is there? She held his gaze. I'm not building this to get even, Roman. I'm building it because when Damien falls, and he will fall, I need to be standing on ground that belongs to me, not to my father's reputation, not to whatever's left of the Rowan name after this. Mine. Something moved across Roman's face. Not sentiment exactly, more like recognition. The way you look at something you've suspected for a long time and are finally seen confirmed. He picked up the marker from the table, turned to the whiteboard, and drew a new line connecting two nodes in the lower portion of the map. The routing is yours, he said. I'll set it up tomorrow. She let out a breath she'd been holding without knowing it. Get some sleep, Roman said without turning from the board. Phase 2 starts at 7. Shab. Damien didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table in the North Clark townhouse with his phone and a legal pad and Patterson's preliminary audit results, and he worked backward through 14 months of financial decisions the way you trace a leak, following the moisture back from the damage to the source. The more he looked, the more he found that wasn't wrong exactly, but was shaped in ways he hadn't noticed while they were being built. Administrative access points that were broader than strictly necessary. Authorization structures that centralized key decisions in a single role. A network architecture that was elegant and efficient and deeply, almost artistically, dependent on the continued cooperation of the person who'd designed it. He'd watched Celeste design it, had sat across from her in meetings where she'd presented proposals in the calm, thorough way she did everything, and he'd approved them because they were good proposals, and because he trusted her competence, and because it had never once occurred to him to ask whether the efficiency she was building was primarily efficiency for him. He pressed the pen hard against the legal pad. The paper tore slightly. Vivian had fallen asleep in the bedroom around midnight. He hadn't tried to stop her, hadn't asked her to stay up. He needed to think without her in the room, needed to hold two things at the same time that were difficult to hold simultaneously: the genuine possibility that Vivian was in danger and had come back because she had no other option, and the equally genuine possibility that Vivian's arrival had been timed with a precision that didn't look like panic. Both things could be true. People in danger still made calculated decisions. Survival required calculation. He knew that from his own life in ways that went deeper than strategy. But the timing, the phone call from the car, the information about his financial network, specific enough to be useful, vague enough to require him to act on it, which meant directing attention toward his books, which meant Patterson running audits, which meant Damien spending the first 12 hours after his abandoned wedding staring at spreadsheets instead of asking harder questions. He wrote 2 words on the legal pad, underlined them twice, and sat back. Who benefits? He looked at the words for a long moment. Then he wrote a name beneath them, then crossed it out, then wrote it again. At 3 a.m, he called Marco. Marco answered on the first ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. Talk to me, Marco said. I need Celeste's full file. Not the background Gerald gave us before the engagement. The real file. Everything we should have built before I put a ring on her finger. A pause. Marco had been with Damien long enough to hear everything in a pause. You think she was running something? I think I handed a brilliant woman the keys to the engine room and told her to make it run better, Damien said. And she did. I'm just starting to ask myself what else she was doing while she was in there. You want me to go at Gerald? Damien considered that. Gerald Rowan hadn't answered his calls. That could be wounded pride. The man's daughter had been publicly humiliated, and Damien was the instrument of that humiliation, and Gerald was not a man who absorbed insults gracefully. Or it could be something else. Not yet. Gerald's too close. He'll either lie to protect her, or he'll fall apart trying to protect himself. And I can't use either of those right now. He paused. Pull the personnel files on everyone who had Tier 1 financial access in the past 14 months. All of them. I don't care how long it takes or how many people it is. That's going to alarm people, Marco said, carefully. If word gets out that you're pulling access files on your own lieutenants, word is already out that I walked out of my own wedding, Damien said flatly. I'm past worrying about optics. Marco was quiet for a beat. All right, I'll have it started by morning. One more thing. Damien turned the legal pad over so he couldn't see what he'd written on it. Vivian, I need everything on where she's been for 14 months. Not what she told me. Everything else. That's a big ask. I know what it is. Another pause, longer this time. Marco had known Vivian from before, had been in the room for most of the history between her and Damien, had watched it unfold and fracture and apparently resurrect. He chose his words with the care of a man who understood that some questions changed things between people. You think she's lying? I think I don't know what she's telling me yet, Damien said, and I don't like not knowing. He ended the call. He sat in the kitchen until the gray end of the October night started showing in the east-facing window, and then he stood, rolled his shoulders, and put the legal pad in the cabinet above the refrigerator behind the scotch. He didn't want it visible when Vivian woke up. He was still running two theories. He needed more information before he could collapse them into one. Chad. Wednesday morning came cold and clear, the kind of Chicago October day that looked beautiful through glass and hit like a fist the second you stepped outside. Celeste was already at the Bridgeport loft when Roman arrived at 7:15 with 2 coffees and a name written on a torn strip of paper. She looked at the name, said nothing for 3 seconds, then, "How certain?" "Certain enough." Roman sat, wrapped both hands around his coffee. "He's been on my peripheral roster for 8 months, listed as a logistics consultant, which is a title I give to people I'm not ready to bring in fully, but want available. He had access to our routing schedules, not the financial data, but the movement patterns, enough to extrapolate timing." Celeste set the paper down. "Does he know you know?" "Not yet." "What do you want to do with him?" Roman looked at her steadily. "He doesn't leave the DeLuca operation with information that belongs to us. Beyond that, I'm asking your preference because he fed the information to someone connected to Vivian, which makes it your problem as much as mine." Celeste thought about it. She thought about it practically, which was the only way she let herself think about the harder parts of the world she was operating in. A man who'd sold timing information to Vivian's contact would sell whatever came next to whoever asked. He was a liability with a limited shelf life either way. He gets cut off. Access revoked, removed from the roster, moved out of any position where he can see our operations. No severance conversation, just gone. And if he talks, what does he actually know? She picked up her coffee. He knows a woman who used to be Damien's fiancée got timing information about our movements. That's not evidence of anything. It doesn't tell Damien where we are or what we're building. She looked at Roman. Cut him off quietly. Don't make it dramatic. Drama draws attention. Roman nodded. He picked up the paper and folded it into his jacket pocket. "The 3 captains. You have meetings this week? First one tonight. Vincent Caruso." She watched Roman's face. "You know him." "I know his reputation. He's careful." "He's careful because he's been watching Damien tighten the structure around him for 2 years, and he doesn't like what he sees." She set her coffee down. "Caruso runs the near North Territory, 3 distribution points, 2 of which overlap with our proposed expansion. If he moves, it's not just about weakening Damien, it creates a corridor we need." Roman looked at the whiteboard map. "He'll want guarantees. He'll want to know that when the structure shifts, his position in the new one is better than his position in the current one." She stood, moved to the board, tapped Caruso's node. "I can offer him that. Genuinely, I'm not stringing him along. The geography makes sense. And if he takes the meeting and then goes to Damien with it?" Celeste turned from the board. "Then I learned something I need to know about Vincent Caruso before I need it more." Roman looked at her for a long moment. You've made your peace with the exposure. I've made my peace with the fact that I can't build something real from a position of total safety, she said. There's no such position. There's only moving faster than the risk and being smarter than the person you're outrunning. The door to the loft opened and a man came in, one of Roman's contractors, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s named Garrett, who had the specific kind of face that was difficult to describe afterward. He gave Roman a nod and took a position near the door without being told. Celeste looked at Garrett and then at Roman. He goes with you tonight, Roman said, non-negotiable. You said that yesterday about the security detail. I say it every day until the situation changes. He met her eyes. The situation hasn't changed. She didn't argue. She turned back to the board and picked up the marker and began adjusting the timing notations in the lower quadrant of the map, because there were 3 more logistics moves to schedule before the week was out, and the map needed to reflect the updated sequence. Garrett stood by the door. Roman watched her work. Outside, the city went about its Wednesday. The meeting with Vincent Caruso happened at 8 that evening, in the back of a Vietnamese restaurant in Uptown that Celeste had used twice before for conversations that needed ambient noise and no cameras. Caruso was 53, compact, with a gray-streaked beard he kept trimmed, and hands that were always slightly too still. The kind of stillness you develop when you've spent 30 years in rooms where involuntary movement can be misread. He was there when she arrived. He'd ordered tea he hadn't touched. He looked at her when she sat down, looked at her the way men in his world looked at things they were trying to categorize. You know you've been the only thing anyone's talking about since yesterday. I know, Celeste said. Half the city thinks you're finished. I know that too. He studied her face. You're not acting like a woman who's finished. I'm not. She put her hands flat on the table. I'm not here to explain myself, Mr. Caruso. I'm here because you've spent 2 years watching your operational autonomy narrow every quarter, and you know who's responsible, and you haven't done anything about it because alone, the math didn't work. She held his eyes. The math works now. Caruso was quiet. He picked up the tea, looked at it, set it down. Word is you ran with some of his money. Word is wrong, she said. I moved capital that I had legal administrative authority over. That's not theft. It's exit. Damien won't see it that way. Damien sees things the way that's useful to him. That's not my problem anymore. Caruso's jaw shifted slightly. He had the look of a man who was interested against his better judgment, which was the most useful look Celeste had seen on anyone in a long time. What are you actually proposing, specifically? I'm proposing that when the structure shifts, and it is shifting, it has already started shifting, you're positioned on the right side of it. I'm not asking you to move against Damien directly. I'm not asking you to do anything that creates immediate exposure for you. She leaned forward slightly. I'm asking you to be available, to slow walk 3 specific operational decisions that require your territory's cooperation over the next 60 days. Not refusal, delay, friction. The kind that looks like normal bureaucratic difficulty. Caruso looked at her for a long moment. And in return, when the DeLuca and Rowan operations formalize their consolidated structure, and that is happening, it's not hypothetical, your near North Territory gets incorporated with full operational autonomy. You answer to a council structure, not to a single boss. You keep what you've built. The word council made something move in Caruso's eyes. He'd been under a top-down structure his entire career. The word landed the way she'd known it would. Who else are you talking to? He asked. That's not information I'm sharing at this stage, she said, for your protection as much as mine. And DeLuca, he's behind this. DeLuca is a partner, she said, not the architect. Caruso looked at her steadily. He was weighing things. She could almost watch him do it. The slow, experienced calculation of a man who'd survived 30 years by being neither too fast nor too slow. He picked up the tea again, and this time drank from it, and she read that as a good sign because people who were about to refuse didn't bother with the tea. I want 2 things, he said finally. Tell me. First, if this goes sideways, if Damien comes at me before the structure is solid enough to protect me, I need an extraction, out of the city, clean, with my family. Agreed, she said. I have the capability for that. It won't be needed, but I'll have it ready. Second, he looked at her with the directness of a man who decided to say the hard thing. Vivian Cross, you know she's back? I know. She's not just Damien's history, she's been… He stopped, chose the next words carefully. She's been moving in my territory the past 3 weeks before she even landed yesterday. Her people, asking questions, making contact with 2 of my mid-level operators. Celeste felt something go still in her chest. She kept her face exactly where it was. What kind of contact? The kind where someone is building a map, Caruso said, figuring out who can be moved and how. She wasn't offering anything, just gathering, but she was gathering in my house. Which means, Celeste said slowly, that she came back with more than just a story about being in danger. She came back with infrastructure. Caruso nodded. She's been building something for a while, maybe from wherever she was. I don't know the full picture, but she walked back into the city knowing more than someone who's been hiding for 14 months should know. The restaurant noise moved around them, plates, voices, the particular warmth of a crowded room on a cold night. Celeste sat with what Caruso had just said and let it fully land, because it needed to land completely before she responded to it. Vivian hadn't just survived. She'd spent 14 months building something that was designed to slot back into Chicago's power structure the moment she returned. And the story about being in danger, the call from the car, the perfectly timed arrival, wasn't just theater to recapture Damien's attention. It was cover. Cover for the fact that she was already in motion before she got on the plane, which meant Vivian wasn't a variable Celeste had miscalculated. Vivian was a third force in a game Celeste had been designing as a 2-player problem. She looked at Caruso. I need to know everything she did in your territory. Every name, every meeting, every piece of information she was asking for. That's going to take some… I know it takes time, she said. I need it anyway, as fast as you can put it together. Caruso studied her face. He was reading something in it. The shift, the recalibration, the thing that happened to a person's expression when the map they'd been working from turned out to be missing a road. This changes your situation, he said. It changes the timeline, she said. It doesn't change the direction. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached inside his jacket and put a card on the table, plain, white, a phone number, and nothing else. That's a clean line. When you need to reach me directly, use it. She took the card. She met his eyes. Are we in agreement? Caruso looked at her for a final moment. The woman who'd stood at an altar 24 hours ago and walked away from it with no tears and no noise, and a plan she was now executing with the composure of someone who'd been waiting years for exactly this kind of Tuesday. He said, We're in agreement. She left the restaurant at 8:47. Garrett fell into step beside her on the sidewalk. The cold came off the lake in gusts that pushed at her coat and her hair, and she walked toward the car with her hands in her pockets and her mind already 3 moves ahead of where her feet were. She called Roman from the back seat. Vivian was in Caruso's territory before she landed, she said without preamble. 3 weeks of groundwork. Her people were mapping his operator network. Roman was silent for 2 full seconds. She's been building here while she was supposedly hiding somewhere else. Yes. Which means whoever has been managing her logistics for 14 months is still managing them, Celeste said. She didn't come back alone. She came back with an operation that was already running. The car moved through the nighttime city, heading south. Roman said, This is bigger than we mapped. Yes, she said again. Are you still in? She looked out the window at the passing streets, the lights, the people, the ordinary city doing its ordinary night. She thought about the whiteboard in Bridgeport and the legal pad Damien was probably staring at right now, and the card in her pocket, and the man who'd just agreed to slow-walk decisions in a territory she needed. She thought about a woman who'd spent 14 months invisible and had used that invisibility the same way Celeste had used her ring and her access and her quiet seat in every meeting where decisions were made. She thought, We are more alike than either of us would be comfortable knowing. I'm not just in, she said. I need you to double the pace on the captain outreach. Not 5. I want all 12 approached by the end of next week. Everyone who has a reason to move, I want to know their position before Vivian gets to them first. That's an acceleration. That's a necessity, Celeste said. We have a window. Damien is still running audits and watching his books and trying to hold the Vivian situation together without understanding what she actually is. That window closes the second he figures out she isn't who he thinks she is. And if she reaches him first, if she tells him what she knows about us before then we stop being subtle, Celeste said, and we find out what we're actually made of. The car turned onto the expressway. The city spread out on both sides, lit and moving and indifferent, the way cities always are when someone is in the middle of something that feels enormous and private. She held the phone against her ear and breathed and thought, and somewhere in the dark behind her, on a street she could no longer see, a man who'd been watching the restaurant since 7:15 picked up his own phone and made a call. And the voice that answered, unhurried and precise and entirely familiar to Celeste Rowan if she'd been there to hear it, said, "She met with Caruso." A pause. "I know," said Vivian Cross. "I've been waiting for her to." Vivian Cross had been waiting for Celeste to meet with Caruso. That was the sentence that sat in Roman DeLuca's chest like a stone for the rest of that night. He'd repeated it back to Celeste twice after she told him, not because he hadn't heard it the first time, but because some information requires the repetition before the full weight arrives. She met Caruso. I've been waiting for her to. 7 words that reframed everything, not just the meeting, not just the past 48 hours, but the entire structure of assumptions they'd been building on. He called Garrett at 11:15. "The tale on Celeste tonight. Did anyone pick her up after she left the restaurant?" Garrett's voice was flat, certain. "We swept the block twice. If someone was there, they were better than anyone I've worked against." "Someone was there," Roman said. He ended the call and stood at the whiteboard in the Bridgeport loft and looked at the map he'd drawn, and Celeste had refined, and they'd both believed was a complete picture of the problem. He found the node he'd labeled VX and looked at it for a long time. He'd placed it as a single point, one woman, one returning complication, one manageable variable. He picked up the marker and drew a circle around it, then a second, larger circle. Then he stopped because he didn't yet know how large the second circle actually was, and drawing it wrong was worse than not drawing it. Celeste arrived at the loft at 10 past midnight. She'd sent Garrett to wait in the car. She came in alone, which was her way of signaling that what she needed to say wasn't for other ears. She didn't take her coat off. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at the new circles Roman had drawn around the Vivian node and said nothing for a moment. "How long?" she finally said. "That's what I don't know," Roman said. "She had someone watching Caruso's restaurant, which means she knew you'd reached out to Caruso, which means she either has a source inside the Captain network or she has a source closer than that." Celeste looked at the board. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was processing hard information. Not blank exactly, but stripped of everything unnecessary. Just the raw mechanism of a very good mind working at speed. She said she'd been waiting for me to meet with Caruso. Not that she'd heard about it. Waiting, which implies she predicted it. Or she pushed for it, Roman said. Celeste looked at him. "If she has someone feeding us information that shapes our decisions," he said carefully, "then she isn't just watching us. She's been steering us." The heating system groaned. Neither of them moved. "The source inside your operation," Celeste said. "The one you identified Wednesday morning. The logistics consultant. Reyes. What exactly did Reyes have access to?" Roman moved to the table, opened his laptop, pulled up a personnel file. He read it quickly, though he already knew most of it. Movement schedules. Routing logistics. He didn't have financial data or strategic planning access. He paused. But he would have known about the Caruso connection. That came through a logistics coordination point. 2 of Caruso's distribution routes overlap with DeLuca freight lines. Reyes managed that overlap. "So Reyes tells Vivian's contact that we're coordinating with Caruso's operation," Celeste said. "Vivian doesn't need to know the details. She just needs to know the direction. And then she sets someone to watch Caruso's known meeting locations and waits for me to show up. That's the sequence. How long has Reyes been feeding her?" "I don't know yet." Roman's voice was tight in a way it rarely was. He was angry, not the explosive kind, the cold kind that was more dangerous because it didn't spend itself quickly. "I pulled him off active access this morning. He doesn't know I know. I was going to do it quietly the way you said. I may need to do it differently now. You need information from him first, Celeste said. Not discipline. Information. Specifically, who is he reporting to on Vivian's side? Because Vivian has had operational presence in this city for at least 3 weeks before she landed. She has a contact structure here. I need to know who's running it. Roman looked at her. That's an interrogation. I know what it is. He closed the laptop. He stood there for a moment with his hands on the table, looking at the wood grain, making a decision he'd been trying to not make since Celeste had called from the car. All right, he said. Tomorrow night. I'll have him at a location by 9. Celeste nodded. She finally took her coat off and put it over the chair. She sat down. She looked exhausted in a way she hadn't looked 2 hours ago, the kind of exhaustion that arrives not from physical effort, but from the sustained weight of recalculation. There's something else, she said. Roman waited. The 3 captains I was going to approach this week. If Vivian has predictive knowledge of my moves, if she knows I went to Caruso, if she can anticipate the logic of who I approach next, then the remaining meetings are compromised before they happen. You want to pause them. I want to understand what she knows before I move another piece, Celeste said, because right now I'm not playing against Damien. I'm playing against someone who's been watching me build this and has been deciding when to let me keep building and when to take it apart. Roman pulled out the chair across from her and sat. He put both arms on the table. She hasn't moved against us directly yet. No. Which means she still needs something from us. Or she's waiting for a specific moment. He looked at Celeste. What does she want that she can't get by going to Damien right now? Celeste thought about it. Thought about what Vivian had come back for. Not just Damien, not just position. Vivian was not a woman who operated from sentiment. If she wanted Damien back, she had him. He'd walked out of a wedding for her. That was already won. So what else was she building toward? She wants the consolidated structure, Celeste said slowly. She wants what we're building, not to stop it, to take it. Roman went very still. Think about it, Celeste said. If Damien loses his captains and his financial network collapses, and then suddenly Vivian is the one who can offer those captains a home, she doesn't come back as the woman who disrupted the Viscari Empire. She comes back as the person who built the replacement. Celeste pressed her hands flat on the table. She's been letting us do the demolition work. She's been waiting to walk in with the construction crew. The room was quiet for a long time. She needs our captain contacts, Roman said. She needs them, and she needs them before we've locked them into our structure, Celeste said. Which is why she's watching my meetings instead of stopping them. She wants the map. Every captain I approach becomes a name on a list she can use the moment our operation is destabilized. And how does she plan to destabilize us? Celeste looked at him. Her eyes were steady and dark, and carrying something that Roman recognized as the look of a person who has just understood something they really didn't want to understand. She goes to Damien, Celeste said, with everything, the transfers, the captain outreach, Roman DeLuca's involvement. She gives him the full picture of what we've been doing, and she gives it to him at the moment when it does maximum damage, when we're exposed enough that we can't protect ourselves, and Damien is angry enough to move fast. She burns us, Roman said. She burns us, Celeste confirmed, and then she walks in behind the fire and picks up what's left. Roman stood. He moved to the whiteboard and looked at the map and then picked up the eraser and erased the second circle he'd drawn around the Vivian node. He drew it again, larger this time, with edges that overlapped several other nodes, captain contacts, logistics routes, financial vehicles, the DeLuca operations border territory. He drew it until the circle enclosed almost half the board. He set the eraser down. When? He said. Soon, Celeste said. She has what she needs from watching me. The only reason she hasn't moved yet is because she's waiting to confirm one more piece. She stopped, looked at the board, looked at the circle. She's waiting to confirm your direct involvement. She can prove I'm running a counter-operation, but running it with the DeLuca syndicate behind it is what turns a private score settling into a territorial war. She needs that piece before she takes it to Damien, because that's what makes it explosive enough to be useful. Roman turned from the board. Reyes. Reyes, Celeste said. She's going to ask Reyes to confirm your involvement, which means she reaches out to him in the next 48 hours. And if we move on Reyes before she does, she loses her confirmation source and she knows we're onto her, Celeste said, which accelerates her timeline. She goes to Damien with what she has, incomplete, and hopes it's enough. So moving on Reyes might trigger the thing we're trying to prevent. Yes. Roman sat back down. He put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds of something he never let people see, the raw processing weight of a problem that didn't have a clean exit. Then he lifted his head. What's our play? Celeste had been thinking about it since the car. We let her reach Reyes. We control what Reyes tells her. She watched Roman's face. If we can get to Reyes tonight, before Vivian contacts him, we can script what he reports back. Give her a version of our operation that's close enough to true that she believes it but wrong in the specific ways that matter. Wrong about your direct involvement. Wrong about how far the captain outreach has gone. We feed her false intelligence through her own source. We buy ourselves a window, Celeste said. A week, maybe less. Long enough to lock the captains who are already in motion and move the financial structure to a position she can't touch. Roman looked at her for a long moment. If Reyes doesn't cooperate, then we're back to 48 hours and a harder set of options. He stood again. He couldn't seem to stay in one position. He moved to the window and looked at the city below, the alley, the one working street light, the dark bulk of the building across. He stood there long enough that Celeste started reading it as something more than thinking. Roman. He turned. There's something I haven't told you. She went still. Reyes, he said, before I identified him as the source, before I knew he was feeding Vivian, he flagged something to me. 3 days ago. I was going to look into it before bringing it to you because I wasn't sure it was real. He paused. He told me he'd heard something through the logistics network about your father. The room seemed to change temperature. Celeste kept her face where it was, but something in her body shifted. A fractional bracing, the physical response to information you're not ready for. What about my father? Gerald Rowan hasn't been unreachable because he's angry about the wedding, Roman said. His voice was level and careful, which was its own kind of signal. He's unreachable because he's been in a meeting, a private, ongoing negotiation, with someone from Vivian's network. It started 2 weeks before the ceremony. The silence in the room was absolute. Celeste said, My father has been talking to Vivian's people. For at least 2 weeks, Roman said, possibly longer. She stood. She moved away from the table, not toward the door, not toward the board, just away from the fixed point, the way people move when they need their body to process what their mind is doing. She went to the window Roman had just left and put one hand on the glass and felt the cold coming through it and stood there breathing steadily, in and out, because the alternative was something she was not going to allow herself. Gerald Rowan, her father, the man who had positioned her inside Damien's operation, who had arranged the engagement and managed the access and presented the whole thing as a family necessity, who had watched her spend 14 months inside the Viscari financial network and had to have known, what she was actually doing there, because Gerald Rowan was not a man who missed things happening in his own house. She pressed her hand harder against the glass. He hadn't missed it. He'd watched it. He'd possibly guided it. Guided it toward what? Did Reyes say what they were negotiating? Her voice was even. She made it even. No, Roman said. Just that there were meetings, regular, structured, not casual contact. And you don't know if Reyes is telling you this as an honest tip, or if Vivian fed him that information knowing he'd bring it to you. No, Roman said again. I don't know that. She turned from the window. Her face had done something she wasn't fully in control of. Hadn't collapsed, wasn't going to collapse, but had shed its professional surface in a way that left something rawer and more essential visible underneath. Roman looked at it and looked away, which was a courtesy she didn't expect and was oddly grateful for. I need to talk to him, she said. Celeste, I need to talk to my father. If Gerald has been coordinating with Vivian's network, going to him directly, tells him that I know. She looked at Roman with eyes that were entirely clear. Good. I want him to know that I know. Because the alternative is that I keep running this operation on the assumption that my father is neutral. And if he's not neutral, I am building on a foundation that someone else controls. She picked up her coat from the chair. Everything I have access to, the financial vehicles, the routing structures, the captain contacts I developed, he knows about. He's known about all of it. He's been in my house my entire life. Roman was quiet. If Gerald has been feeding Vivian, Celeste said, then Vivian doesn't need Reyes to confirm your involvement. She already has a source who knows everything. She has my father. The sentence landed in the room like a physical object. Roman moved first, pulling out his phone. I'm pulling all our financial vehicles off the structures your father has visibility into. Tonight. Right now. There's no time make time he said. If Gerald has been talking to Vivian, those vehicles are burned. Every structure he's touched is compromised. We move everything we can tonight and we accept the losses on what we can't move fast enough. She knew he was right. She stood there knowing it while every organized part of her mind ran the numbers. The vehicles she could redirect, the ones that required Gerald's authorization structure, the ones that were so embedded in Rowan family financial architecture that extracting them quickly was like trying to pull load-bearing walls. Half of it is going to leave marks, she said. I know. Damien's auditors will see the movement. I know. It accelerates everything, she said. Once Damien sees that kind of movement, he stops running audits and starts running operations. He comes at us directly. Then we're not building anymore, Roman said. We're fighting. She looked at him. He looked back. The loft hummed around them, the heat, the city outside, the two laptops open on the table showing data neither of them was reading anymore. She thought about the whiteboard map with its careful nodes and lines and circles, thought about the months of architecture and patience and calibrated distance, thought about standing at an altar with her hands perfectly still and feeling like she had all the time in the world. She had run out of time. Start the moves, she said. I'll deal with my father. She was out the door before Roman could say anything else, and Garrett was off the wall outside and falling into step beside her without being told. And she was down the stairs and into the cold street with the city pressing in from every side, and she was already on the phone. Gerald Rowan answered on the second ring, which told her everything. He'd been waiting. Celeste. His voice was careful, not surprised. Careful. I need to see you, she said. Tonight. A pause. It's past midnight. I know what time it is. Another pause. Longer. She heard him breathing on the other end of the line, and she thought about his face, the face she'd known her whole life, the face of the man who'd taught her to read a balance sheet when she was 12, and a shell company structure when she was 16, and the specific arithmetic of criminal enterprise before she was old enough to vote. The man who'd looked at her over a champagne glass at her rehearsal dinner and said, "This is the greatest achievement of our family." She'd thought he was talking about the wedding. "You know," he said. Not a question. "Tell me how long," she said. The street outside the loft was empty. Garrett walked a step behind her. The cold was bitter and specific, the kind that gets inside a coat. She stood on the sidewalk under the one working light and listened to her father decide how much truth he was going to give her. "Come to the house," he said finally. "Not over the phone. The house is compromised, and you know it." "Celeste, how long?" she said again. Hard. The kind of hard she hadn't used with him before, had never needed to, had always managed to get what she needed without. He said, 8 months. 8 months. She had been inside Damien's operation for 14 months, building her architecture, and for 8 of those months her father had been sitting across a table from someone in Vivian Cross's network. She had been building a foundation, and Gerald Rowan had been talking to the person who planned to pour concrete over it. "What did you give her?" Celeste said. Silence. "Dad?" The word came out stripped of everything. No anger in it yet, just the raw edge of a question she needed answered more than she'd needed anything in a long time. "What did you give her?" "She approached me," he said. "She had information about your operation that she said she'd take to Damien unless I cooperated. She knew about the captain outreach. She knew about Roman. She had documentation, Celeste. Real documentation, not inference. She could have ended everything you'd built in 24 hours. "So you cooperated," Celeste said. I bought you time. You bought her access. I bought you time, what? He said again, more forcefully. Everything I gave her was controlled. I managed what she received. I shaped it. Like you shaped me, she said. The silence on the line was a different kind now. The kind that comes after something is said that can't be unsaid. Celeste, she knows everything, Celeste said. Whatever you thought you were controlling, she has been running you the same way she ran Damien, the same way she tried to run me. You told yourself you were managing the information and you were handing her the keys. Her voice was steady and cold and entirely adult in a way that felt new, that felt like something shifting permanently in the way she understood herself in relation to this man. How much does she know about Roman's direct involvement? A pause. She knows he's a partner. Does she have documentation? Yes. Celeste closed her eyes, opened them. The city stayed where it was. And the captain contacts? The three you'd reached by last week. She has their names. Caruso. Yes. She stood on the sidewalk and understood that the operation she'd been building, the careful, patient, precisely engineered counterstructure she'd spent over a year constructing, had been visible to Vivian Cross for 8 months. Every move she'd made had been watched, catalogued, and preserved by a woman who had turned her own father into an unwitting instrument. Everything she'd believed was hidden had been, to some degree, a performance in front of an audience she didn't know was there. She said, "Does she know about this conversation?" "What?" "Right now, this call. Does she have access to your phone?" A beat of silence that was one beat too long. "Gerald? I'm not certain." She ended the call. She looked at Garrett. "We need to move. Now. Different location. Not the loft. Not any location my father has ever heard about." Garrett was already moving toward the car. She followed, and the city swallowed them both into its nighttime indifference. And somewhere on the north side of the city, in a townhouse on North Clark, Damien Vescari was sitting across from Vivian Cross with a legal pad full of conclusions he was almost ready to act on, and Vivian's phone buzzed once with a message she glanced at, and then sat face down on the table with the specific composure of someone receiving exactly the news they expected. She looked up at Damien. "I think," she said, "that it's time I showed you what I've actually brought back with me." She reached into the bag beside her chair and placed a manila folder on the table between them. Damien looked at it. He did not touch it yet. "What is this?" "Everything," she said. "About Celeste Rowan, about Roman DeLuca, about what's been happening to your operation for the past 8 months, who's been coordinating it, and how far it's already gone." She held his eyes. "I've been building this case for a long time, Damien. I came back the moment it was complete enough to be useful to you." He looked at the folder. He looked at her face. He reached out and opened it. The first page was a financial summary, transactions, vehicle numbers, amounts, dates. He recognized 2 of the vehicles immediately. He turned the page. Captain names. 3 of them, with documented contact logs showing outreach from a number that his people had not been able to trace. He turned the page again. Photographs. Surveillance quality, taken from distance, but clear enough. Celeste Rowan entering a restaurant in Uptown. Celeste Rowan and a man he recognized as Vincent Caruso at a back table. Celeste Rowan getting into a car registered to a subsidiary he now understood belonged to Roman DeLuca. He turned 3 more pages. Each one was worse than the last. By the time he reached the final page, a communication log, partially redacted, showing the coordination between Celeste and a DeLuca financial account over a period of 11 months, his jaw was set in a way that his face only did when he had moved past the stage of processing and into the stage of deciding. He closed the folder. He looked at Vivian. "How long have you had this?" "Long enough to make sure it was complete," she said. "I wanted to give you something you could act on, not just suspect." He nodded, very slowly. "And what do you want in return?" Vivian looked at him with those eyes that never showed all the way to the bottom. "I want to be here," she said. "When you take it back, I want to be standing next to you when the structure is restored." She paused. "I want what I should have had before I left." Damien looked at the folder. He He looked at the woman across from him who had walked back into his city with a dossier that documented an operation running inside his own house. He thought about 14 months and an altar and a woman in white standing at the end of an aisle with her hands perfectly still. He thought about what perfectly still actually meant. He picked up his phone and called Marco. "Get everyone in," he said. "Full room, 2 hours." He looked at the folder. "We're moving tonight." And 40 minutes away, in the back of a car heading toward a location her father had never heard of, Celeste Rowan received a text from a number she didn't recognize. But the message was one she understood immediately because she had written its contingency into her planning 8 months ago when she'd first suspected this moment might come. It said, "He has the folder. He's calling the room." She read it. She set the phone on her knee. She looked out the window at the passing city, and she felt something move through her that was not quite fear and not quite calm, but something between the two that had no clean name, the specific sensation of a person standing at the edge of a plane that has just collapsed, looking at the distance to the ground. She had 40 minutes, maybe less, before Damien moved. She had a financial architecture half dismantled, a captain network partially built, a partner scrambling to protect his operation, and a father who had handed her blueprint to the enemy 8 months ago and told himself it was for her protection. And she had one thing Vivian didn't know she had. She picked up the phone and made a call that she had been holding for exactly this contingency. A call to a number that only one other person in the city had. A number that belonged to a man who had been watching the North Clark townhouse for 3 days and had just watched Damien Vescari open a manila folder and pick up his phone with the look of a man who had decided to go to war. "It's time," she said when he answered. The man on the other end said, "How bad?" "Bad," she said, "but not finished." She ended the call. She looked at Garrett in the front seat. "How fast can you get us to the Caldwell?" 15 minutes. "Make it 10. The car accelerated into the Chicago night, and behind them the city's power structure was already beginning to move. Damien's men gathering, phones ringing in darkened apartments, lieutenants pulling on coats and reaching for weapons. The whole terrible machinery of a Mafia empire shifting into motion, aimed, all of it, directly at the woman in the back of a car who was the only person in the city still running toward the fire instead of away from it. The Caldwell Grand at 11:40 on a Wednesday night was mostly quiet. The lobby bar was winding down. The last 2 guests at the counter nursing drinks they'd stopped tasting an hour ago. The bartender moving glasses with the particular efficiency of someone calculating how soon he could close. The concierge desk was staffed by a single woman who looked up when Celeste came through the revolving door and then looked back down, because guests came and went at all hours, and it wasn't her business to read their faces. Celeste didn't go to the desk. She went to the service corridor behind the elevator bank, the one that required a staff keycard she'd kept when she checked out that afternoon. Garrett was behind her. She didn't look back. The 17th floor was empty. Her suite had already been cleaned and reassigned on paper, but the physical room was unoccupied. She knew the hotel's booking system the way she knew her own handwriting, and she'd left a flag in the reservation software 3 months ago that ensured this particular suite stayed dark in the week following any major event. The hotel staff would have assumed it was a standard post-event hold. It wasn't. She got the room open. She and Garrett went in. She didn't turn on the main lights, just the desk lamp, which threw a low gold circle across the work surface and left the rest of the room in gray shadow. She opened the laptop she'd had in her bag, not the one from the Bridgeport loft, a separate machine, air-gapped from everything else she ran, that she'd packed in the overnight bag she'd retrieved from the car before Garrett drove it to the new location. She had 35 minutes before Damien's room convened, maybe less. Her fingers were moving before she was fully seated. She pulled up the financial architecture she'd built over 14 months, all of it, every layer, the full map, and she started making decisions. Not the careful, measured decisions of a woman with time and options. The fast, surgical decisions of a woman who needed to save what she could before the building came down. The vehicles her father had visibility into were already compromised. She didn't try to save them. She severed them. Clean cuts. Transferred what liquidity was accessible into accounts 2 layers removed from anything Gerald had ever touched. Wrote off the rest as the cost of the breach. It hurt in the specific way that losing months of careful construction hurts, but she didn't let it slow her hands. Pain was information. It didn't have to be a break. The captain contacts, Caruso and the 2 others she'd approached. She texted from a clean number. 3 identical messages. Go dark, no contact for 72 hours. Wait for signal. She didn't explain, they'd understand or they wouldn't, and there was nothing more she could tell them that wouldn't cost more time than she had. Roman called at 12:09. I've been moving the vehicles, he said. His voice was tight, controlled, the sound of a man who was running and refusing to sound like it. How much did she get? Enough, Celeste said. The 3 captain names, the financial summary, documented proof of your involvement. A short silence. How documented? Communication logs. 11 months. She heard Roman absorb that, heard the quiet on his end that was him recalculating. That came from Gerald. Yes. Then she's had the core of it for 8 months, and she's been choosing when to use it. His voice was harder now, the control costing more. She let us build. She let us recruit. She was going to let us get far enough that when she burned it, the fire would take out both our operations and leave her standing in the gap. I know, Celeste said. She played both sides. She's been playing a third side, Celeste said. The one nobody was watching because nobody knew it existed. She heard movement on Roman's end, voices in the background, low and urgent. I have 3 people here. We're mobile. Where do you need us? She looked at the laptop screen, looked at the map she'd been modifying, the nodes she'd cut and the ones still standing, the shape of what remained versus what had been taken. She thought about Damien's room convening, 12 or more people around a table, the folder open in front of them, Marco running through the documentation with the thoroughness he brought to everything. She thought about what Damien would do first, not the long game, not the architecture. Damien moved fast and direct when he moved. He'd go for the physical location before the financial one. He'd want to find her, which meant the Caldwell was already a limited window. But it was also something else. It was the location Vivian didn't know about. Gerald knew the hotel, Rowan family property, but Gerald didn't know about this specific arrangement, this specific room, the flag in the reservation system. She'd built it quietly, months ago, for exactly the kind of moment where she needed ground that was hers alone. She had maybe 20 minutes of safety left in this room. I need you at the Caldwell in 15 minutes, she said to Roman. Service entrance on the south side. I'll have Garrett meet you. We'll be there. She ended the call and turned back to the laptop and made 3 more moves. Fast, irreversible, the kind that closed doors behind them. She was burning certain structures to protect others, and she was doing it without flinching because flinching now was the thing she absolutely could not afford. At 12:17, her phone rang from an unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Then something made her instinct, the specific quality of the timing, the way it landed in the middle of everything else with the weight of something deliberate. She answered. Don't go to ground, said the voice on the other end. Male, middle-aged, carrying the flat Midwest vowels of someone who'd grown up in this city. If you disappear tonight, he burns everything and calls it self-defense. You need to be visible. Who is this? Someone who's been watching your situation develop for longer than you know. A pause. My name is Theo Carver. I worked for Damien Vescari for 9 years. I stopped working for him 14 months ago when I found out what he did to the last person who got in Vivian Cross's way. Celeste went still. What did he do? There was no boating accident, Carver said. Vivian didn't disappear because she was threatened. She disappeared because Damien moved against her. He tried to have her killed. She survived, barely, and she spent 14 months building a case not just against him, but against everything around him. The danger she's in is real, but so is what she's doing. She's not choosing between Damien and you. She's choosing between Damien and herself, and right now you're in the way. The room was very quiet. The city pressed against the windows 17 stories down. Why are you telling me this? Celeste said. Because Damien tried to kill someone I was responsible for protecting, Carver said, and I've been waiting for the right moment to make that matter. You're the right moment. Another pause. I have documentation. Damien's direct order, the team he used, the money he paid. If you can get that in front of the right people in the next 6 hours, his room full of captains becomes a room full of men who understand that their boss tried to murder his fiancée and lied about it for over a year. And Vivian? Vivian knows I have it. That's why she needs to finish this tonight, before I can use it. Once I hand that documentation over, she can't control the narrative anymore. She can't be the savior who brought down Celeste Rowan. She becomes the survivor of a murder attempt who built her revenge on the backs of two people who didn't know they were doing her work. Celeste's mind was moving at a speed that she could almost feel physically, like temperature, like pressure. She pulled the laptop close and started typing with one hand while she held the phone with the other. Where's the documentation? Safe, but not useful to you unless you're in a position to receive it and act on it. He paused. The room convenes in... She heard him check something. 18 minutes. Marco will run the first 30 minutes on logistics and security. Damien will speak last. He always does. You have a window between when the room convenes and when Damien commits to a specific action. In that window, if the right information reaches the right captain, the whole dynamic changes. Caruso, she said. Caruso is the most independent thinker in that room, Carver confirmed. He's also the one who has the most reason to question Vivian because she was working his territory without his knowledge, which he will find out before tonight is over. How? Because I'm going to tell him in the next 10 minutes, but he'll want to hear from you directly, not a message, you. She looked at the window. The city below was dark and lit at the same time, the way it always was. She thought about going into that room, about walking into a situation where Damien had documentation, had momentum, had 12 captains and a table full of weapons, and the particular territorial fury of a man who'd realized he'd been played inside his own house. She thought about every measured, careful calculation she'd made over 14 months and what it was worth in the next 6 hours. She said, "Tell Caruso I'm coming to him. Not the room, somewhere he can step out for 5 minutes. Find me a location in the building and send it to this number." The Caldwell? Don't confirm that over the phone. A pause. All right, 10 minutes. He ended the call. She was already moving. She closed the laptop, put it in the bag, crossed to the window and looked down at the service entrance where Roman would be arriving. She texted Garrett, "South entrance, 2 minutes. Bring Roman up the service stairs." Then she stood at the window for a single, deliberate moment and let herself fully understand the shape of what she was about to do. She was going to walk into a building where Damien Viscari's entire operation was convening, and she was going to do it voluntarily, and she was going to do it because it was the only move that created the outcome she needed, rather than the outcome everyone else was building toward. She picked up her bag. She left the room. Roman arrived at the service entrance 90 seconds after she reached the ground floor. He came through the door with 2 men behind him, not Garrett's size, leaner, moving with the specific economy of people who'd trained for confined spaces. He looked at her face and said, "You have a plan." "I have a direction," she said. "I need to brief you in 60 seconds. She did it in 45. Roman listened without interrupting, which was one of the things that made him who he was. When she finished, he said, "Carver, you trust him." "I trust that his interests align with mine tonight," she said. "That's enough. If Damien sees you in that building, Damien will see me eventually," she said. "I'm choosing when and where." She looked at him directly. "I need you to be somewhere specific when it happens, not with me. You being present with me tonight is what validates the documentation Vivian has. We need to separate." Roman's jaw tightened. "I don't like that." "I know." "Celeste, Roman." She held his eyes. "Everything I've built knowing this moment might come. The moment where the careful version runs out and what's left is just what you're actually willing to do." She held his gaze. "I'm willing to walk in there." "Are you willing to be somewhere else while I do it?" He looked at her for 3 seconds. Long enough. "Where do you need me?" She told him. He didn't like it, and he didn't argue. He took his 2 men and went back out the service entrance into the night, and Celeste and Garrett moved through the service corridor toward the elevator bank, and her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that said only, "3rd floor, East Conference Room B. Caruso is stepping out in 8 minutes." She looked at Garrett. "3rd floor." They took the stairs. Vincent Caruso was already in the corridor outside Conference Room B when she arrived. He was standing with his arms crossed and his face doing the careful thing it did, but underneath the careful thing was something she recognized as the controlled edge of a man who'd just been given information that changed his assessment of the room he'd left. He looked at her. He looked at Garrett. He said, "Carver told me about Vivian's people in my territory." 3 weeks of groundwork, Celeste said, "without your knowledge." "Without my knowledge," he repeated. His voice was flat in a way that was its own kind of fury. "And the folder Damien has tonight, Vivian built that. Over 8 months, using my father as a source." Caruso looked at her steadily. "She played you." "She played everyone," Celeste said. "That's the only move she knows." She held his eyes. "But there's documentation, direct evidence that Damien ordered an attempt on Vivian's life 14 months ago. Evidence that changes every assumption in that room about who Vivian actually is and what she's actually doing here." Caruso was quiet. "She didn't come back to help him," Celeste said. "She came back to take what he has. She used me to weaken his operation. She's using him to destroy mine. And once both structures are destabilized, she steps in and consolidates. She let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. The men in that room have worked for Damien for years. Some of them are going to decide that loyalty holds regardless. But some of them, the ones who've been watching what Vivian's presence does to Damien's judgment, are going to have questions." "Questions don't stop a room," Caruso said. "No," she said. "But documentation does. When the right captain in that room sees hard evidence that their boss ordered a murder and covered it up for 14 months, the calculus changes. Not for all of them, but for enough." Caruso looked at the floor, then back at her. "You want me to take the documentation into the room?" "I want you to be holding it when Damien finishes speaking," she said, "so that when he asks for the room's commitment, there's a voice that says wait before the hands go up. And if Damien moves on me for it, then you're in exactly the position you're already afraid of," she said. "Just sooner." She held his gaze. "You told me 2 nights ago that the math was changing. This is the math changing." He looked at her for a long moment. She could feel the seconds moving, real, physical, each one closing a door somewhere in the building above her. Then Caruso said, "Get me the documentation." She texted Carver. 40 seconds later, her phone received a file. She forwarded it to the number Caruso had given her without looking at it herself, because looking at it was time she didn't have. 5 minutes, she said. "That's how long before you need to be back in the room." Caruso pocketed his phone. He straightened his jacket. He looked at her with the expression of a man stepping onto ground he wasn't certain would hold. If this goes wrong, it goes wrong for both of us," she said. "I know that." He nodded once. He walked back toward the elevator. She turned to Garrett. 2 minutes. We need to be on the 4th floor." "The ballroom floor," Garrett said. "The ballroom floor." They moved. The stairwell was empty. They came out on the 4th floor, and the corridor was the same corridor she'd walked down 2 days ago in $40,000 of white silk with her father on her arm. But the flowers were gone now, and the chairs were stacked, and the double doors to the main ballroom stood closed with only the ambient light of the city coming through the transom windows above them. She could hear, faintly, through the walls, the sound of the room on the other side of the building where Damien's captains were gathering, chairs moving, voices at low register, the collective sound of men preparing for something. She pushed open the ballroom door. The room was dim, stripped down, the kind of empty that event spaces have between occasions. A waiting emptiness, not the emptiness of abandonment. The chandeliers were off, the candles were gone. The tables had been broken down and pushed to the perimeter. It was just the floor and the ceiling and the city light coming through the tall windows on the east side. And somewhere in this room 2 days ago, she had stood at the end of an aisle and watched a man walk away from her and felt a very small smile move across her face before she put it away. She stood at the center of the floor and waited. She didn't have to wait long. She heard the door on the far end of the room, the service entrance on the north side, open, and then she heard footsteps crossing the empty parquet, and then the dark shape of a man resolved out of the dimness and became Damien Vescari with his jacket open and his tie gone, and his face carrying the specific set of a man who'd made a decision and was past the point of renegotiating it. He stopped 12 feet away. She didn't move. He looked at her. "You came here," he said. Not a question, Not an accusation, just the fact of it, delivered in a voice that had been stripped of everything except the residue of a very long night. "I came here," she said. "Why?" "Because you would have found me regardless," she said, "and I'd rather choose the ground." He studied her face. His was doing something complicated. The professional layers he wore like armor were present, but thinner than she'd ever seen them. And underneath, she could see the structural exhaustion of a man who'd spent 48 hours discovering that his entire environment had been something other than what he believed. "The folder," he said, "is mostly accurate," she said. He absorbed that without expression. "You were running an operation inside my organization." "I was building a position," she said, "because I knew I was going to need one." "Need one for what?" "For when you did exactly what you did," she said, "on Saturday, in front of 300 people. She held his gaze steadily. "You thought I was an arrangement, Damien. You thought I was a useful component you could walk away from and pick up again when it was convenient. I needed you to understand that I wasn't." His jaw tightened. "And Roman DeLuca is a partner, yes. You brought a rival operation into my house." "Into the space you left when you walked out of that ballroom," she said. "You left a vacuum. I didn't create the vacuum." He moved, not toward her, just a shift of weight, the kind of physical adjustment that happens when something lands harder than expected and the body has to accommodate it. "The transfers." "Mine to make," she said, "legally and operationally. You know that, or Patterson would have used different language." "The captains are men who needed to understand their options," she said. "You've been narrowing their autonomy for 2 years. I gave them a different conversation. That's not a betrayal. That's what happens when people stop feeling valued." The room held them in its darkness. 12 feet of empty floor between them. The city light from the east windows laying long rectangles across the parquet. She could hear his breathing, could hear the tension in it, the way it was slightly too controlled, the way controlled breathing always announces its own effort. "Vivian," he said, "what about her?" "She brought me evidence. She brought you a weapon she built over 8 months using my father," Celeste said. "She built it to use on me, yes. But she's going to use it on you next. Not because she hates you, Damien, because you're useful to her right now, and you will stop being useful the moment your operation is destabilized enough that she can step into it herself." She paused. "Ask yourself why she came back now. Not 6 months ago. Not a year ago. Now, after 14 months of someone quietly working on your captain structure and your financial network. She waited until the foundation was already cracked. She saw it move through him, saw him want to refuse it and not be able to. "She came back because she needed you angry and moving fast," Celeste said. "She needed you to go after me before you looked too closely at what she's actually brought back with her." "She told me she was in danger," he said, but the sentence came out with less weight than he probably intended. "She was in danger," Celeste said, 14 months ago, from you." The silence that followed that was a different kind of silence than any that had come before it. It had density to it. Damien's face went through something she couldn't fully track. A series of rapid private recalibrations. The look of a man being handed a piece of information that doesn't destroy his world so much as it restructures every memory he has of the past 14 months. "Carver," he said finally. "You know the name." "I know the name." His voice was very quiet now. "He came to you." "He came to me with documentation," she said. "Your order, the team, the money." She held his eyes. "You tried to kill her, Damien." He didn't deny it. That was the thing that would stay with her afterward. Not what he said, but what he didn't say. The way the denial didn't come. The way his face simply continued its internal reckoning without offering her a refutation. "She survived," Celeste said, "and she spent 14 months building a case against everyone. You, me, the operation. She used my work as the instrument of your destruction, and she used your guilt about what you did to her as the instrument of mine." The far door of the ballroom opened. Both of them turned. Marco stood in the doorway, and behind him, visible in the corridor light, 3 of Damien's men. Marco's face was set in a way Celeste recognized. Operational, committed, the face of a man executing a decision that had already been made. He looked at Damien. "Room's waiting," he said. We ready to move? Damien didn't answer immediately. He was looking at Celeste. She was looking back at him. 12 feet of empty floor and 20 years of a world they both inhabited, and a specific 48 hours that had changed the internal geometry of every assumption either of them had been operating under. Damien, Marco said. From somewhere in the building, the floor above moving quickly, she heard footsteps. More than 2 people. Coming fast. Garrett stepped forward from the edge of the room where he'd been standing, invisible in the shadows. His hand was inside his jacket. Marco saw it. Marco's hand moved. Damien said, "Marco," sharp, cutting, and Marco stopped. The footsteps reached the floor above and kept moving. Not toward them. Toward the room on the other side of the building where the captains were gathered. She heard, distant, muffled, but unmistakable, the sound of voices rising. Caruso's voice among them, not shouting, presenting. The particular cadence of a man delivering information into a room that wasn't expecting it. Damien heard it too. His face changed. He looked at Celeste with the specific expression of a man who has just realized that the conversation he's been having in this room is not the only conversation that's been happening, and that while he was standing here with his face doing its complicated reckoning, the ground beneath the room upstairs was shifting in ways that his presence there might no longer be able to reverse. He took 2 steps toward her, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes clearly, the genuine structural exhaustion of a man who had been operating on the wrong map for a very long time. He said, low and direct, "Where is she?" I don't know," Celeste said, "but she's not in this building." "How do you know?" "Because if she were here, this conversation would already be over." He looked at her face for a long moment, reading it the way he read everything, calculating, measuring, and then he turned to Marco and said, "Get Vivian on the phone, right now." Marco pulled out his phone. He dialed, he waited. He looked at Damien. "Goes to voicemail." Damien said nothing. "I'll try the townhouse." "She's not at the townhouse," Damien said. He said it with the flatness of a man who has arrived at a conclusion he wishes he hadn't. She knew where this was going the moment Carver reached out to Celeste. "She's already—" He stopped. He pressed one hand briefly against his mouth and then lowered it. "She's already moved." The voices upstairs were louder now. More of them. The room had broken into something that was no longer one voice presenting to many, but many voices responding at once. And even through the floor, Celeste could hear the specific quality of it. Not unity, not a room moving toward a single decision, but fracture. The sound of men who've been given information they can't unknow and are now making individual choices about what to do with it. Marco heard it too. He looked at the ceiling, then at Damien. "We're losing the room." "I know," Damien said. "If Caruso has the documentation—" "I know, Marco." "Then we need to— I said I know." His voice came out harder than he probably intended, and Marco went quiet. Damien stood in the dim ballroom for a moment. This room where 2 days ago there had been flowers and candles and 300 witnesses to the first decision in a cascade of decisions that had brought all of them here. And then he did something Celeste didn't expect. He looked at her. He said, "Tell me what you need to stop this from burning everything." The question landed in the room like something thrown. She looked at him. She thought about every answer she could give. She thought about what she actually needed. Not what she wanted, not what justice looked like in some abstract sense, but what the next 6 hours required to prevent Vivian Cross from walking out of whatever darkness she'd moved into tonight, and back into a structure that had just been handed to her. She thought about Caruso upstairs, and the captains fracturing, and Roman somewhere in the city positioned exactly where she'd told him to be. She opened her mouth to answer, and then the window on the east side of the ballroom, the tall, city-facing window 15 feet to her left, exploded inward in a cascade of glass and cold air, and the sound that followed was a gunshot, and Damien Vescari went down. He hit the floor hard, one hand going to his left shoulder, and Celeste was moving before she'd fully processed what had happened, dropping low, moving toward him across the parquet while Garrett was already at the window, and Marco was shouting into his phone, and the glass was still falling, and the cold October air was flooding the room like water through a breach. And somewhere outside in the dark above the Chicago street, in a position that had been chosen with the same precision as everything else Vivian Cross had done in the past 14 months, A shooter was on the roof of the parking structure across the street. Garrett had the angle in 4 seconds, came back from the shattered window low and fast and said, 300 feet, elevated, northeast. And that was enough. Marco was already on the phone screaming at someone. Celeste was on the floor beside Damien with both hands pressed against his left shoulder, her palms flat against the wound, feeling the blood come through her fingers with the particular warmth that was always shocking no matter how prepared you thought you were for it. Damien was conscious. His teeth were set and his breathing was the controlled, deliberate breathing of a man who'd been shot before and knew the first thing you lost when you panicked was blood pressure. He looked at the ceiling. His right hand found her wrist. Not grabbing, just locating, making sure she was there. How bad? He said. She pressed harder. Through the shoulder, high, missed the lung. She could tell from the sound of his breathing, from the absence of the wet catch that meant something punctured. You're going to be all right. That's the second time tonight you've told me something I wanted to hear, he said. His voice was strained but coherent. Still deciding if I trust your read. Right now my read is the only one you have, she said. Marco crouched beside them. Car's coming around, 2 minutes. The shooter, Damien said. Gone, Garrett said from the window. By the time anyone gets up there. Damien's jaw tightened. He tried to push himself up and Celeste pressed her hand harder against his shoulder and he stopped. Don't, she said. Not a suggestion. He looked at her face. Something moved in his expression. Surprise, maybe, at the tone, or at the fact that he'd listened. The room upstairs, he said to Marco. Caruso has it, Marco said. The words cost him something. They're not moving against anyone, but they're not moving with us either. It's a standstill. Vivian's people, Damien said. Nobody's seen her since she left the townhouse at 11:15. Marco's face was doing the thing faces do when a man is processing a betrayal that confirms what he suspected, but still lands harder than the suspicion did. She played it clean. The shooter was a contract hire. Nobody from her core people. Nothing traceable back tonight. Damien was quiet for a moment, looking at the ceiling, feeling Celeste's hands on his shoulder and the cold air coming through the broken window and the specific weight of a situation that had been constructed around him with the kind of patience he himself had always admired in other contexts. She tried to kill me, he said. She tried to kill both of us, Celeste said. You surviving was always part of the plan. A dead Damien Vescari creates a power vacuum she can't control. A wounded, discredited Damien, one whose room has just fractured, whose captains are holding documentation of a murder order, whose operation is hemorrhaging, that's a Damien she can position herself against. She held his eyes. She wanted you to survive tonight so she could be the one to finish you later. On her terms. He looked at her. His color was bad and his breathing was working harder than it had been a minute ago, and she adjusted the pressure of her hands and watched his face and cataloged every sign she could read because she was not going to let him bleed out on a ballroom floor over a woman who had played them both. You need to move, she said to Marco. Now. The car came. They got him out through the service entrance, Garrett on one side and Marco on the other, Celeste moving ahead to check the corridor and the stairwell and the loading bay. The city outside was cold and indifferent, and the street was empty, and the parking structure across the way showed nothing. No movement, no remaining presence, just the geometry of a position that had been used and abandoned. Garrett had been right. Whoever Vivian had hired was already gone, already in a car heading toward an airport or a train station or some other exit that had been arranged before the trigger was pulled. Celeste got in the car with Damien. Marco drove. Garrett followed in a second vehicle. She kept her hands on the wound and didn't talk and let the city move past the windows and thought about the next 6 hours with the particular cold clarity that arrives when everything else has burned away, and what's left is only the problem in front of you and the resources you have to address it. Her phone was in her jacket pocket. She got it out with one hand, called Roman. I need you at the location, she said, the one I told you about. Already there, he said. I heard shots. One round, Damien took it in the shoulder. He's stable. She paused. Vivian moved. I know. She's not at any of the locations we had on her. She's leaving the city, Celeste said. Or she thinks she is. She looked at the city moving past the glass. Call Carver. Tell him we need the full documentation package released, not just to Caruso. Every captain in that room and every law enforcement contact Carver has been holding this for. All of it. Tonight. A pause on Roman's end. That's burning a lot of cover. The cover is already burned, she said. The only question now is who controls the fire. She ended the call. She looked at Damien. He was watching her with the eyes of a man who was in pain and managing it and using the management of it as a way to stay present in a situation that kept moving faster than his body could currently keep up with. The documentation, he said. Carver's releasing it. To law enforcement. Yes. His mouth tightened. For a man in his position, that word, law enforcement, carried the weight of everything he'd spent 20 years staying ahead of. That ends a lot of things, he said. It ends the right things, she said. He was quiet. The car moved through the city. She kept her hands where they were and felt his pulse under her palms. Steady, too fast, but steady. And she thought about a man who had spent 20 years building an empire and had made one decision in one moment that had set every subsequent event in motion, and whether he understood yet that the decision hadn't been about Vivian at all. It had been about what he'd always believed about the women around him, and what that belief had cost every single one of them. I'm sorry, he said. She looked at his face. For Saturday, he said, the way I... He stopped. The pain moved through his expression, and he wrote it and came back. You deserved better than that. She held his eyes. She thought about what she wanted to say and what was true, and whether those were the same thing, and found that they were, mostly, which was rarer than people admitted. You did what you always do, she said. You made a fast decision based on incomplete information and executed it without looking back. She paused. The difference is that this time the person you underestimated had a plan. Something moved across his face that was almost, not quite, a smile. Yeah, he said. I noticed. They took him to a private medical facility in Lincoln Park that Marco had used for off-record situations twice before. The physician on call was a woman named Dr. Solis, who asked no question she didn't need answered and moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been receiving calls like this one at odd hours for years. Damien was in her hands within 20 minutes of arriving. The bullet had done what Celeste had assessed. High shoulder, no vital structures, significant blood loss and tissue damage, but nothing that 3 hours of work couldn't address. Celeste waited in a corridor outside the procedure room with blood on her hands and jacket and the specific stillness that follows sustained adrenaline when it finally, incrementally, begins to release. She sat on a plastic chair against the wall and looked at the floor and breathed. At 2:40 in the morning, Roman found her there. He came down the corridor and sat in the chair beside her without saying anything for a moment. He looked at the blood on her jacket. He looked at her hands, which she'd cleaned but not completely, the way you don't completely when you're moving fast and there's still work to do. Carver released it, he said finally. Full package. It's been received by 3 federal contacts and distributed to every captain who was in that room tonight. He paused. It's also been received by 2 investigative journalists Carver has had relationships with for years. By morning, it's a story. Good, she said. The captains. He leaned forward, arms on his knees. Caruso called me 40 minutes ago. 8 of the 12 are formally withdrawing from Viscari operations pending, his words, clarification of the situation. The other 4 are in the wind. The 4 who'll stay loyal. 2 will. The other 2 are just scared and not ready to commit to anything yet. He paused. It's over, Celeste. As an organized structure, what Damien had, it's not recoverable. Not after tonight. She nodded. She knew that, had known it would land here, had been building toward this landing for over a year, and knowing didn't make the weight of it less. It just made it accurate. Vivian, she said. Roman's face changed slightly. Airport, O'Hare. She had a private charter booked under a subsidiary name that we traced through the logistics network. He looked at Celeste. Federal contact intercepted her at the gate 40 minutes ago. Carver's documentation includes the murder order against her, which means she's simultaneously a victim and a co-conspirator, depending on how the next weeks shake out. He paused. It's not a clean resolution. Nothing about her has been clean, Celeste said. No, Roman agreed. They sat in the corridor for a moment. The facility was quiet around them, the particular quiet of a medical space in the middle of the night, low lights and distant machinery, and the sense of things being managed in rooms you can't see. My father, Celeste said. Roman was careful. He's not at the family house. I have a location on him. He went to a hotel in Evanston at 10 o'clock tonight. Paid cash. She thought about that. Thought about Gerald Rowan in a hotel room in Evanston, sitting with what he'd done, trying to decide what version of it he could live with. She thought about the man who'd taught her to read a balance sheet at 12 years old, and told her over and over that, in their world, family was the only thing you could count on. And she thought about 8 months of meetings with Vivian Cross's network, and what that sentence meant when you held it next to that fact. Let him stay there tonight, she said. I'll deal with him tomorrow. Roman looked at her. Are you all right? She looked at the floor, at the dried blood on her jacket cuffs, at her hands, which were perfectly still on her knees. I don't know yet, she said. I'll tell you when I figure it out. He nodded. He didn't push. That was one of the things she'd always valued about him, the capacity to receive an honest answer without trying to improve it. The story broke at 6:15 in the morning. By 7, every major outlet in the city had it. By 8, it had gone national. The documentation Carver released was extraordinary in its specificity. Damien's order, the operational details, the money, the team, the cover story about the boating accident. 14 months of a lie, laid out in the kind of granular detail that left no interpretive room. The story also included, as a necessary context, the outline of what Vivian had built in response. The intelligence network, the contact structure in Chicago, the manipulation of Gerald Rowan, the strategic timing of her return. Both sides of it, because Carver had been watching both and had documented both with the thoroughness of a man who'd been waiting a long time for the right moment to matter. Celeste read the first story on her phone in the corridor outside the procedure room. Then she put the phone in her pocket and went to find Dr. Solis. Damien was out of the procedure and sedated, and would remain sedated for at least 4 more hours. Dr. Solis told her this in the corridor with the direct efficiency of someone reporting facts, no editorializing. She said he'd need 3 to 4 weeks of careful recovery before he had full use of the arm, and that there would be physical therapy, and that his overall prognosis was entirely positive, assuming he didn't do something stupid in the next 72 hours. Celeste thanked her. She went back to her chair. She called Marco. He's stable, she said. Dr. Solis has him for the next several hours. Don't move him. Understood. Marco's voice was different than it had been at any point in the previous 14 months. Not reduced exactly, but recalibrated. He'd spent the night watching everything he'd built his adult life around restructure at a speed no one could fully absorb in real time. Celeste. He said her name like it cost something. What he did. Leaving you at the altar. What came after. I want you to know Marco, she said. I should have said something. That morning when he told me, Marco. She said it more firmly, but not harshly. Right now, the only thing that matters is that he's in good hands. Everything else is a conversation for later. All right? A pause. All right, he said. She ended the call. She sat in the plastic chair and looked at the wall and let herself, for the first time in 48 hours, simply stop moving and be in the specific moment she was in without managing what came next. It lasted about 90 seconds. Then her phone rang. It was Gerald Rowan. She looked at his name on the screen for a long moment. Then she answered. I saw the story, he said. His voice was the voice of a man who had aged considerably since she'd last heard it. Everyone's seen the story, she said. Celeste. He stopped. Started again. I want to explain. I know what you'll say, she said. That she had documentation on me and threatened to use it. That you were protecting me. That every meeting was controlled and calibrated and you were managing the information she received. She paused. I know that's what you'll say because it's probably partially true. And I know that the other part, the part you won't say because you can't say it to yourself yet, is that she offered you something, not just protection, position, a place in whatever she was building, because that's how Vivian works. She doesn't just threaten, she offers. And you looked at what I was doing and you looked at what she was offering and you made a calculation. The silence on the line was absolute. You raised me to make calculations, she said. I know what one looks like. He said, I'm sorry. And the way he said it, not defending, not explaining, just the stripped-down fact of it, was the most honest thing she could remember him saying to her in years. maybe ever. She sat with it. "I know you are," she said finally. "I'm not ready to do anything with that yet. But I know you are." She ended the call. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she put it in her pocket and pressed both palms flat on her thighs and took a single long breath and let it out. So, 3 weeks later, the Caldwell Grand reopened after a closed week that the hotel management officially attributed to a scheduled renovation. The fourth-floor ballroom had been repainted, a different shade, lighter, not the deep cream it had been before. The chandeliers had been cleaned. The parquet floor had been refinished in the east section where the glass had come through the window. Celeste walked through it on a Thursday afternoon, alone, without a specific reason except that she'd wanted to see it, and this was the first time she'd had a Thursday afternoon without something urgent demanding the hour. The room looked good, looked like itself again, cleaned of the occasion that had happened in it, returned to the neutral potential that event spaces carry between their uses. She stood at the center of the floor for a moment. Then she left. She had an office now, a real one, not the folding tables in the Bridgeport loft, though she'd kept the loft for other purposes. The office was on the 32nd floor of a building in the West Loop that she'd taken the lease on 2 weeks after the story broke, under the name of the holding company she and Roman had incorporated the previous month. It was a legitimate company. That was the thing she'd told Roman when they'd sat across from each other finalizing the structure. Everything from here is legitimate, not adjacent to legitimate, not structured to look legitimate, actually legitimate. It would cost more and take longer and require a different kind of patience than the work she'd spent the past 14 months doing, and she was entirely prepared for all of that. Roman had looked at her across the table with the expression she'd come to understand was his version of agreement when he didn't want to make it ceremonial. The holding company managed 3 assets she'd moved into clean vehicles before the collapse. It would take 18 months to begin showing real returns. She had enough in reserve to sustain 18 months without strain. After that, she'd see. Gerald Rowan had cooperated with the federal investigation. He'd been the first to cooperate, actually, had called the contact Carver recommended before the sun came up on the morning the story broke. His attorney had negotiated aggressively, and the outcome would be years away from final, but the cooperation itself had been immediate and total. He was living in the family house alone, and Celeste had spoken to him 4 times in 3 weeks. Brief conversations, practical in nature, the specific register of 2 people who love each other and are not currently able to say so without the weight of everything else getting in the way. She thought they'd get there. She thought it would take a long time. She thought both things could be true. Damien Viscari had publicly surrendered control of the Viscari criminal network on the 11th day of his recovery, issuing a statement through his attorney that was terse and specific and contained no language about why. The 12 captains had already been disbanding for days, some cooperating with federal investigators, some simply removing themselves from organized criminal activity in ways both public and private, some relocating entirely. The structure Damien had spent 20 years building didn't collapse dramatically. It unwound, quietly, comprehensively, like a knot being worked loose by patient hands. He was still in the city. She hadn't seen him since the night at the Caldwell. Vivian Cross was in federal custody pending a hearing that her attorneys were working to delay by every legal mechanism available to them. The charges were complex and layered: conspiracy, obstruction, and as an associated matter, the question of what exactly had happened 14 months ago off the coast of Florida, which turned out to have involved considerably more than a boating accident on either side. It would be years before it was fully adjudicated. That was the way of things. The law was patient in its own grinding way. Carver, Theo Carver, who had spent 14 months building his documentation and waiting for the right moment, had given his formal testimony and then, as far as Celeste could tell, had simply gone back to his life. She had his number. She'd sent him one text the morning after the story broke. It said, "Thank you." He'd replied, "You would have found a way regardless." She wasn't sure that was true, but she appreciated that he believed it. On a Saturday morning in late November, Celeste drove to the Caldwell Grand for the second time that week. Not the hotel, the old building next door, the converted stone structure that had been part of the original Caldwell property for 60 years, and that she'd been in discussions to acquire for the past 3 weeks. The acquisition would finalize Monday. She walked around the exterior in the cold morning air, looking at the facade, at the windows, at the proportions of the thing. Beside her was an architect she'd worked with once before, a woman named Park, who was efficient and direct and didn't fill silences unnecessarily. Load-bearing structure is solid, Park said. The interior is what needs work, first 2 floors especially. What's your timeline for a full renovation assessment? 3 weeks for the structural report, 6 weeks for the full plan. Get me the structural report in 2, Celeste said. Park wrote something in her notebook. What's the intended use? Celeste looked at the building, at the stone facade, at the windows that looked out over the same Chicago street she'd been looking at her whole life. Mixed use, she said. Commercial ground floor, residential above. Nothing ornamental. Something that lasts. Park nodded and wrote that down too. They walked the exterior perimeter once. Park asked technical questions that Celeste answered accurately from memory because she had read the property records 3 times and retained what mattered. They agreed to speak Monday after the acquisition closed. Park left. Celeste stood on the sidewalk in front of the building for a moment, alone in the November cold, hands in her coat pockets, looking at what she was going to build. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from an unknown number, but the cadence of it was immediately identifiable. 4 words, no signature. Can we talk? Please. She looked at those words for a long moment. She thought about a man recovering from a bullet wound in a city that no longer organized itself around him. She thought about what it cost a person like Damien Vescari to write the word please. She thought about the conversation in the ballroom, the 12 feet of empty floor between them, his hand finding her wrist in the dark, the question he'd asked her right before the window came in. Tell me what you need to stop this from burning everything. She thought about the fact that he'd asked, that he'd been there, in that room, on the back foot, injured by the choices he'd made, and he'd looked at her and asked what she needed instead of demanding or threatening or simply trying to take it. She thought about all of it. She typed back, I know, not yet. She put the phone in her pocket. She turned and looked at the building one more time, the stone, the windows, the proportions of something that had been standing in this city for 60 years and would, with the right attention, stand for 60 more. Then she walked to her car. She drove south on Michigan Avenue with the lake on her left and the city on her right, and the late November light came flat and gray off the water and lay across everything with the particular quality of a season in transition, the kind of light that doesn't flatter anything but makes everything look exactly like what it is. She drove without music. She let the city be the city, let it press against the windows with its noise and its weight and its absolute indifference to the private reckonings of every person moving through it. She thought about the past year, about what she'd built and what she'd lost, and what she'd learned the difference was between the two. She thought about the woman she'd been 14 months ago, competent, positioned, running a plan with the confidence of someone who believed she'd accounted for every variable. She thought about what it had cost her to find out that confidence and control were not the same thing, and that the variables you didn't account for were always the ones shaped like people you trusted. She thought about her father, about the conversation they would eventually have, the real one, the one underneath all the practical register of the past 3 weeks. She would sit across from him and she would let him explain and she would listen, not to adjudicate but to understand, because she was her father's daughter in more ways than she liked to acknowledge. And one of those ways was that she'd always been capable of understanding a calculation even when she despised the choice behind it. She thought about Roman, who was at his office on the South Side today running his legitimate operation with the same methodical attention he brought to everything, who had been her partner through the hardest weeks of her adult life and who had never once asked for more than she was able to give in return, and who she hoped understood without being told that this was a rare and significant thing. She thought about Damien. She would talk to him. Not yet. Not yet was the truth. But at some point, in some room that was not a ballroom and not a room full of captains, and not the interior of a speeding car with blood on her hands, she would sit across from Damien Vescari, and they would have the conversation that had been waiting since the moment he'd walked out of the Caldwell Grand, and she'd smiled and taken off her ring. She didn't know what that conversation would produce. She was not in the business of predicting outcomes from insufficient data anymore. She'd had enough of certainty. Certainty was what you built to manage fear, and she had decided she was done managing fear, and ready to simply have it when it arrived and act anyway. She crossed the bridge over the river and the city opened up around her, the whole enormous, indifferent, beautiful, difficult thing, and she held the wheel and breathed and drove toward whatever was next with her eyes completely open, which was the only way she'd ever actually known how to move. Behind her, the Caldwell Grand receded in the mirror, its limestone facade gray and solid in the November light. Inside it, a ballroom waited in its clean emptiness for the next occasion, the next flowers, the next gathered witnesses, the next moment when people came together to mark something they wanted to believe would last. Celeste didn't look back at it. She hadn't looked back since the day she walked out of it in her wedding dress, and she wasn't going to start now. Some things you leave in the room where they happened, some things you carry forward as the thing they changed you into. She had learned, over the course of the most difficult year of her life, to tell the difference. The city moved around her. The light held. She drove.